Welcome. Let yourself settle here for a moment. Wherever you are, whatever shape the day took, let it begin to loosen now. There is nothing you need to carry into the next 2 hours. Whatever you were thinking about, let it become a little quieter. Not gone, just quieter. You don't have to force anything. Just allow the breath to slow, the body to soften, the mind to drift a little sideways, the way it does at the edge of sleep when something interesting arrives just before everything goes dark. We are going somewhere tonight, somewhere enormous, somewhere that took centuries to fall, and that, in a certain light, never finished falling at all. The question is a simple one, or it seems simple the first time you ask it, but the longer you hold it, the more it opens up, the way a room seems larger in low light than it does in the middle of a bright afternoon. The question is this: why did Rome fall? And behind that question, moving quietly like a river beneath ice, is an even older one. Did Rome fall at all? Every civilization that has ever reached a certain size, a certain weight, a certain accumulated gravity, has eventually asked what Rome asked of itself. What does it mean to be great? What does it mean to hold the world together? And what does it mean when the holding begins slowly, barely perceptibly at first, to give way? We don't ask these questions only about Rome. We ask them because Rome asked them first, and loudest, and for the longest time, and the echo has never entirely stopped. Tonight, we are going to walk through this question the slow way, not rushing to an answer, not trying to pin it down, but following it through centuries, the way you might follow a river, not to arrive anywhere, but simply to see where the water goes. We are going to move through the rise and the long, long plateau, through the cracks that appeared so gradually that people living through them could not always see them, and through the strange, haunted centuries after. And at the end, we are going to sit with something that is less a conclusion and more a kind of quiet understanding, that some things don't end. They transform, and the transformation is worth following all the way down. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Feel the weight of your body settling. Whatever surface you're resting on, let it hold you. You don't need to do anything except breathe and listen. The story we're going to follow tonight is one of the oldest in Western memory, older than the textbooks that tried to contain it, older than the popular idea of gleaming marble and straight roads and invincible legions. It is a story about time and power, and what happens when something too large to be replaced begins slowly to change into something else. We are just beginning. There is no hurry. The question has been waiting 1,500 years. It will wait a little longer while you settle in. Picture the city, not as a ruin, not as it looks in photographs of broken columns and overgrown forums, but as it was, the city of Rome at the height of the 2nd century of the Common Era. 1 million people, perhaps more. Streets so crowded by day that wheeled traffic was banned until after dark, when the rattling of wooden-wheeled carts over cobblestones kept the light sleepers awake until nearly morning. Imagine you are standing in the middle of it. The smell alone is extraordinary. Bread and fish and incense and animals, and the slow baking of stone in summer heat.
The noise is enormous, and yet beneath it all, if you listen, there is a rhythm, an ancient, self-sustaining rhythm that this city has been keeping for 700 years. 700 years. Let that number sit quietly for a moment. By the time Rome reached its peak, it had already been a city, a functioning, evolving, complex human settlement for as long as the distance between us and the early Renaissance. That is a long time for anything to survive. That is a long time for anything to hold. And it would hold for a long while yet. The Great Crisis was not immediate. It was not sudden. It came the way all the most significant changes come, not as an event, but as a drift, not as a single broken thread, but as a slow unraveling of something very large, very complicated, and very reluctant to admit that it was changing. Why did Rome fall? Historians have been asking the question seriously for over 3 centuries. Edward Gibbon began his famous account in 1776, a book so long and so thoroughly researched that it ran to 6 volumes and covered 13 centuries of history. He had his answers. Other historians have had different ones. The list of proposed causes is long enough to be its own history. Military overextension, economic strain, political instability, climate change, disease, the pressure of peoples from the east and north, the shifting of trade routes, the slow corrosion of civic identity, the weight of bureaucracy, the cost of empire. Each of these answers is true in its way, and yet none of them, alone, seems quite sufficient. What is interesting, what is worth holding gently as you drift, is that Rome knew something was happening long before it was over. Roman writers in the 3rd and 4th centuries described a world that felt tired, heavier than it used to be. There is a quality in the literature of that period, a kind of melancholy, a sense of greatness slightly past its peak, the way late afternoon light falls differently than noon light, golden but longer in the shadow. They could feel it, and still they could not stop it, and that, more than the fall itself, is the part worth sitting with tonight. But we are not going to rush there. We are going to begin at the beginning, not with the fall, but with the rising. Because to understand why something ends, you must first understand what it was when it was most alive. You must feel the shape of the thing before you can understand how the shape changed. So let the city of Rome settle around you now in imagination, its heat and its noise and its impossible density of human life. Let the question soften into the background, the way music fades when you stop listening closely, and simply let it play. Why did Rome fall is the river we're following, but tonight, for a little while, we begin at the source. Before there was an empire, there was a story, and before the story, there was a place. 7 hills rising from the floodplain of a river, not particularly impressive by the standards of mountains or coastlines, but positioned with a quiet geographic logic that would, over centuries, prove almost impossibly useful. The river was the Tiber. The hills had names that would eventually be spoken in every corner of the known world. And on those hills, sometime in the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, or perhaps earlier, the dates blur the further back you look, people began to gather. Why did Rome fall? It is still too early to ask. First, we have to understand how it rose. And it rose, like most things that rise slowly and stay risen for a long time, from very humble ground. The Romans themselves had a story about their beginning. They always did. It was the kind of story that a civilization tells when it wants to understand not just where it came from, but what it was made of, what essential quality ran through its history, like a vein of metal through stone. The story began with a city burning, with a man carrying his elderly father on his back through streets full of fire and falling walls, with a long voyage across a dark sea to a shore that was not yet a home. His name was Aeneas. He was a Trojan, one of the few survivors of the fall of Troy, and according to the story the Romans would eventually adopt as their own founding myth, it was his bloodline, generations later, that produced the twins, Romulus and Remus, the boys raised by a wolf on the banks of the Tiber. Let the image come softly. A she-wolf in a cave along a riverbank. Two small boys curled against her warmth in the darkness. The river moving slowly outside, the hills rising beyond. It is an image so strange and so old that it has outlasted almost everything else about the civilization that created it, still visible today in bronze and marble and countless reproductions. The she-wolf with her twin charges, looking out at the world with amber eyes that hold no particular expression. Just presence, just survival. The story of the wolf is not history, but it carries something that history sometimes cannot. The feeling of a people trying to name what they believed was essential about themselves. Hardness, endurance, the capacity to survive in conditions that would destroy softer creatures. The historical founding of Rome, insofar as archaeology can trace it, was considerably less dramatic. Settlements on the Palatine Hill, dating to around 900 BCE, gradual clustering of villages on adjacent hills, a low marshy area between them that would eventually be drained and paved and become the Roman Forum, the center of the ancient world for nearly 1,000 years. The process was slow and ordinary and unremarkable, the way most things that eventually become enormous begin, incrementally, without announcement, one small decision at a time. But those decisions accumulated, and the geography held them together. The Tiber provided water and a route to the sea. The hills provided defense. The central plain provided farmland. It was not the most obviously promising location in the Italian peninsula, but it was good enough, and good enough, repeated over centuries, has a way of becoming something extraordinary. For the first 2.5 centuries of its existence, Rome was a kingdom, ruled by a succession of kings whose historicity is questionable, but whose reputations the Romans preserved with great care. 7 kings, traditionally, each associated with a particular quality or contribution. Romulus, the founder; Numa Pompilius, who gave Rome its religious institutions; Servius Tullius, who organized the people into classes; the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, whose arrogance became the thing that ended the monarchy entirely. In 509 BCE, according to the traditional account, Tarquin was expelled, not killed, not conquered, expelled, thrown out by his own people, who had decided that one man holding absolute power was a condition they were no longer willing to accept, and in his place they built something new. They called it the res publica, the public thing, the republic. It was not a democracy in the way we might use that word today, and it was not an equal society by any modern measure. Power was carefully distributed, but it was distributed among the elite, the patrician families who had always held the land and the influence and the weight of ancestral reputation. And yet it contained something that the kingship had not, a built-in resistance to the accumulation of too much power in too few hands. 2 councils, elected annually, each with the power to veto the other. A senate that advised and influenced, and in practice often decided. A complex web of magistracies, praetors, quaestors, censors, tribunes, each with defined roles and limited terms. It was complicated. It was sometimes paralyzed by its own complexity, but it worked in its way for nearly 500 years. Why did Rome fall? The question is still waiting. But here In the early centuries of the Republic, you can begin to feel one of the long threads that will eventually pull loose. The Republic worked because the men who ran it, believed in the system over any individual ambition, believed that the rules mattered more than any one man's desire to be king. That belief was the invisible architecture that held everything else up, and it was not invincible. It was, like all beliefs, subject to erosion, subject to the slow pressure of exceptional men who began to feel that the rules had been designed for smaller people. But that is still centuries away. For now, the Republic is young and vigorous and expanding. Let it breathe.
The early Romans were not, by their own account, a sophisticated people. They did not have the philosophy of the Greeks, or the ancient mysticism of Egypt, or the accumulated wealth of the Eastern civilizations they would eventually absorb. What they had was a particular quality they called virtus, a word we translate as virtue, but that originally meant something closer to the quality of a man: strength, endurance, reliability, the willingness to do what was required regardless of personal cost. It was a farmer's ethic, essentially, the ethic of people who understood that the ground does not care about your feelings, that the harvest comes or doesn't come based on the work you put in, that survival is a collective enterprise, requiring each person to carry their share and not complain too loudly about the weight.
Lie quietly for a moment and imagine it. The Rome of the early Republic. Not grand yet, not marble yet. The temples are still terracotta and wood. The streets are unpaved. The Forum is a gathering place of mud and market stalls and the smell of cattle. Men walk to the Senate in muddy boots because they came straight from the fields. There is something almost touching about it, the beginning of what will become the most powerful civilization in the Western world, still small enough that a single person could walk from one edge of it to the other in an hour. The 7 hills are still quiet at night. The Tiber moves in the darkness below. The wolves are still real, not yet metaphorical, somewhere in the hills beyond the city's edge. This is where Rome began, not with marble and legions and aqueducts, but with 7 hills and a river and a group of people who had decided collectively that no single person should ever hold all the power again. That decision, that early, fragile, imperfect commitment to a shared system is the seed of everything that follows, the greatness and the eventual unraveling both. Because the same energy that built the Republic would one day strain against it. The same ambition that expanded Rome across the Mediterranean would eventually turn inward toward the city itself. But not yet. For now the dream is young, the hills are quiet, the river moves, and somewhere in the distance, barely visible, the future is beginning to take shape, slow and enormous and completely unhurried, the way all truly significant things begin. Every system of government is, at its heart, a bargain. Not always a written one, not always one that anyone consciously agreed to, but a bargain nonetheless. An arrangement between the people who hold power and the people who do not, built on a shared understanding of what each side owes the other, and what happens when one side stops paying. The Roman Republic was one of the oldest and most elaborate versions of this bargain that the ancient world ever produced, and for nearly 5 centuries it held. Why did Rome fall? Part of the answer lives here, in the years when Rome was not yet falling, when it was in fact ascending, because the seeds of an ending are almost always planted in the soil of a beginning. The bargain of the Republic rested on a word the Romans used constantly, almost reverently: auctoritas. We translate it as authority, But it meant something richer than that. It was not power held by force. It was influence earned through reputation, through demonstrated wisdom, through the accumulated weight of a life well and usefully lived. The Senate did not technically command, it advised, but its advice carried auctoritas, and in Rome that was often more binding than a direct order. This distinction matters. The Republic functioned not because it had a perfect constitution, but because enough people believed in the legitimacy of its institutions. Belief was the architecture. The marble came later. The patricians, the old aristocratic families, held the original monopoly on power. They filled the Senate, held the magistracies, interpreted the religious laws, and maintained a careful control over who could rise and how far. But Rome was also full of plebeians, the common people, the farmers and craftsmen and small merchants who made up the vast majority of the population and provided the vast majority of the soldiers who fought Rome's wars. And the plebeians, over the course of the early republic, did something remarkable. They organized. Slowly, persistently, across generations, they pushed back against patrician exclusivity, not through revolution, but through a series of carefully staged withdrawals. They simply left, packed up and walked out of the city to a nearby hill, and said, "Run your republic without us." The Romans called these events secessions. The first occurred around 494 BCE, when the plebs withdrew to the sacred mount outside the city and refused to return until their grievances were heard. It worked. The patricians, facing the prospect of a city without workers or soldiers, negotiated. And from those negotiations emerged the office of the tribune of the plebs, a magistrate elected exclusively by and from the common people, with a power unlike any other in the Roman system, the power of the veto. A single tribune could stand up in any Roman assembly and say one word, intercessio, I interpose, and stop any action of any magistrate in its tracks. One ordinary person, properly elected, with the legal authority to say no to the most powerful men in the city. It took another century and a half of struggle, a long, patient, mostly bloodless conflict the historians call the conflict of the orders, before the plebeians achieved genuine legal equality, the right to hold consulships, the right to sit in the Senate, the right to hold priesthoods. Each gain was hard-won, slowly negotiated, embedded into law and practice. By around 287 BCE, with the passage of the Lex Hortensia, the decisions of the plebeian assembly became binding on all Romans, patrician and plebeian alike. It was not equality in any modern sense. The wealthy still dominated, the old family still carried the heaviest auctoritas, but the system had bent without breaking. It had absorbed pressure and redistributed it, the way a well-built structure absorbs stress. That capacity, to flex rather than shatter, was one of the Republic's most underappreciated strengths.
Let yourself rest here for a moment. Feel the weight of centuries passing in the space of a few quiet sentences. This is what history feels like from the inside of it. Not dramatic, not fast, but an accumulation of small pressures and small yields, grievances patiently held and carefully negotiated. The Republic did not become strong overnight. It became strong the way stone becomes smooth, through long contact with the things that would otherwise wear it away. Why did Rome fall? One answer, partial and incomplete but worth holding, is that it eventually lost this capacity, the capacity to bend. But that is still far ahead.
Rome was also, from very early in its history, a city that absorbed rather than simply conquered. When it defeated neighboring peoples, the Latins, the Samnites, the Etruscans, it did not always simply enslave them or reduce them to subject peoples. Often, with varying degrees of generosity, depending on how the conquest had gone, it extended to them some form of Roman legal status. Citizenship, in its various grades, became one of Rome's most powerful tools of expansion. This was unusual. Most ancient powers collected conquered peoples as tribute payers, as laborers, as subjects. Rome collected them as Romans. Not always immediately, not always completely, not always willingly, but the direction of travel was consistent. The circle of who counted as Roman kept expanding. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula, not through a single overwhelming military campaign, but through a long, patient process of alliance building, war-making, and selective incorporation. And then it looked beyond Italy, to the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, to the North African coast, where the great trading city of Carthage sat at the center of its own commercial empire, to Spain, to Greece, to the east. The wars that followed, the Punic Wars against Carthage, the Macedonian Wars against the Greek kingdoms, were enormous, brutal, and transformative. Rome nearly lost the first. It almost certainly should have lost the second, when Hannibal crossed the Alps with his army and his elephants and spent 15 years devastating the Italian countryside. But it didn't lose. It endured, and it won. And each victory made it larger. But expansion carried a cost that the Republic was slow to recognize. Every new province required administration, and administration required men. And the men who administered distant provinces accumulated wealth and military loyalty in ways that the careful balance of the Roman constitution had never anticipated. A consul serving in Spain or Greece or North Africa was very far from the Senate's oversight. He commanded armies that answered to him personally. He distributed plunder that created personal networks of obligation. The Republic had been designed for a city-state. It was being asked to govern a Mediterranean empire, and the seams, invisible for a long time, were beginning to show.
Lie still and let the Republic move through its centuries around you. The slow accumulation of law and precedent, the patient negotiation between competing interests, the gradual expansion outward from those 7 hills to the edges of the known world. It is a story that takes 500 years to tell properly, and we have only touched its edges tonight. But the shape of it matters. The Republic worked because it was built on a bargain, and the bargain held as long as enough people believed it was worth keeping. The moment exceptional men began to feel that the bargain was beneath them, that the rules had been written for smaller ambitions than theirs, something in the invisible architecture began, very quietly, to shift. The question waits. Why did Rome fall? We are getting closer, but not yet. For now, let the Republic stand, imperfect, complicated, and quietly magnificent in its own way. Let it stand a little longer in the dark.
There is a moment in the life of almost every large thing, a country, an institution, a person, when it crosses a threshold it did not entirely intend to cross, when what it was becoming quietly becomes what it is, before anyone has had time to properly notice. Rome crossed such a threshold in the 1st century before the Common Era, and it crossed it not in a single dramatic instant, but in a long, slow, grinding series of civil wars, political murders, and constitutional crises that lasted nearly 100 years. Why did Rome fall? Some historians would argue it began here, not with the barbarians at the gates, not with plague or economic collapse, but with the moment Rome stopped being able to govern itself. The Republic had held for nearly 5 centuries, But by the 2nd century BCE, the stresses that had been building quietly in the structure were beginning to express themselves in ways that could no longer be smoothed over or negotiated away. The problem was, at its core, one of scale. Rome had conquered an empire. The wealth of that empire, the land, the slaves, the tribute, the trade, had flowed disproportionately to the already wealthy, concentrating in the hands of a senatorial aristocracy that was growing richer and more powerful with each passing generation. Meanwhile, the small farmers who had always formed the backbone of the Roman legions were struggling. Wars kept them away from their land for years at a time. When they returned, they often found their farms unworkable, their neighbors bought out by wealthy landowners who ran vast estates on slave labor. The bargain of the Republic was quietly breaking down, piece by piece, field by field. Two brothers tried to fix it. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tribunes of the plebs in the 130s and 120s BCE, proposed land reforms that would redistribute publicly held land to the landless poor. Their proposals were legally reasonable and constitutionally defensible, and they were met, both of them, with assassination. Tiberius was beaten to death by senators using the legs of broken chairs. Gaius, facing a similar fate, took his own life. The Republic had survived 5 centuries of external pressure. What it could not survive as easily was the decision by its own ruling class that murder was an acceptable political tool. Once that line was crossed, it proved very difficult to uncross. What followed was a century of extraordinary men and extraordinary violence. Marius, the general who reformed the legions and recruited directly from the landless poor, binding soldiers' loyalty to their commander rather than to the state. Sulla, who marched his army on Rome itself, the first Roman general ever to do so, and briefly made himself dictator. Pompey, who cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 3 months and then couldn't figure out what to do with himself in peacetime. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, who funded his way to military command and died with molten gold poured down his throat, according to legend, by the Parthians who captured him. And then, arriving late but moving with extraordinary deliberateness, Julius Caesar. Let the name settle quietly. Julius Caesar. It has been spoken so many times across so many centuries that it has become more monument than man. A word that eventually gave rise to the titles Kaiser and Tsar. A name that entered the language of power so completely that it became the word for power itself in a dozen different tongues. But he was a man first. A politician of extraordinary skill and ambition, a general of genuine brilliance, a writer, his accounts of the Gallic Wars are still read today, of remarkable clarity and slightly self-serving precision. He did not set out, or so he always claimed, to destroy the Republic. He set out only to protect his own position, his own dignity, his own earned right to a triumph. The Republic, in defending itself against him, made his crossing of the Rubicon inevitable. The Rubicon was a small river in northern Italy, unremarkable by any geographic standard, barely worth naming under ordinary circumstances. But it marked the boundary between the Roman province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. Roman law forbade any general from crossing it with his army under arms. To do so was by definition an act of war against the Roman state. In January of 49 BCE, Julius Caesar crossed it anyway. He is supposed to have said as he crossed, "The die is cast." Whether he said it or not, the phrase captures something true about the moment. There was no going back from that crossing. The Republic, already weakened and fractured, would not survive the civil war that followed.
Why did Rome fall? Here is one answer, quiet and worth sitting with. Because the men it produced at its greatest became too large for the system that produced them. Caesar was not an aberration. He was a logical outcome. The Republic had spent 5 centuries rewarding military success, celebrating individual virtus, elevating the men who won the most wars and conquered the most territory. And then it was surprised when those men turned their abilities and their loyal armies inward. The system had trained Caesar. It just hadn't built a cage large enough to hold him. Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March 44 BCE, stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate by men who believed they were saving the Republic. They were not. His death triggered another round of civil war, more savage and more exhaustive than the last. And when the dust finally settled, when the last battles had been fought on land and sea, when Mark Antony and Cleopatra were dead in Egypt, and the last of Caesar's enemies were gone, one man was left standing. His name at birth had been Gaius Octavius. Caesar had adopted him posthumously. History would call him Augustus.
Augustus was everything Caesar had not been. Patient where Caesar was impulsive, careful where Caesar was bold, politically subtle where Caesar had been theatrically direct. He understood, with a clarity that Caesar had lacked, that Romans could accept a king if you never called him one. So he called himself princeps, first citizen. He kept the Senate, the magistracies, the elections, the entire apparatus of the Republic, carefully preserved and carefully emptied of real power. He held the tribunician power, which made his person legally inviolable. He held the imperium, the supreme military authority. He controlled the treasury and the provinces with the largest armies. He was, in every functional sense, a monarch. But the word was never spoken, and the forms of the Republic were maintained with such scrupulous care that many Romans chose to believe it.
And so the empire began, not with a declaration, not with a coronation, but with a polite fiction that everyone tacitly agreed to maintain. Augustus ruled for 45 years. Under him, Rome experienced a peace and prosperity so sustained that his reign would eventually give its name to an entire concept, the Augustan Age, a shorthand for a golden era of cultural and political flourishing. Poets wrote, roads were built, the marble city that Julius Caesar had dreamed of became real. Why did Rome fall? Augustus himself, in his old age, is said to have asked something close to that question in reverse, whether he had played his part well, whether the performance had held. He had built something enormous and beautiful, and in certain lights deeply fragile, because it rested not on the old republican bargain of shared power, but on one man. And when one man holds everything, the question of what happens when that man is gone becomes quietly the most important question in the world. Let that question drift with you into the dark. There is no hurry. The empire is just beginning, and it has centuries yet to run. The interesting thing about a crack in a foundation is that it is almost never visible from the surface. The floor above it looks the same, the walls stand, the roof holds. People walk through the rooms of a building with a cracked foundation and feel nothing unusual beneath their feet. No trembling, no unevenness, no signal that anything is wrong. The crack works in silence and in darkness, slowly widening under the weight of everything above it, patient as geology, invisible until the morning it is not. Why did Rome fall? For most of the people living through the 2nd century of the Common Era, the question would have seemed absurd. Rome was not falling, Rome was Rome, and yet in the foundations, something was shifting.
The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE marks for many historians a kind of invisible threshold, the moment the long afternoon of the Pax Romana began almost imperceptibly to cool. His son Commodus, as we have already visited, was the first sign. But Commodus was not the cause of what followed. He was more a symptom, a first expression of a structural problem that ran far deeper than any individual emperor's character. The problem was succession. The problem was, more precisely, that the empire had no reliable mechanism for it. A republic chooses its leaders annually through election and rotation. A hereditary monarchy at least offers the clarity of bloodline. The Roman Empire, in its strange hybrid form, offered neither, a system in which power passed through adoption, military acclaim, Senate approval, and occasionally simple murder, with no consistent principle to adjudicate between them.
After Commodus was strangled in his bath on the last night of 192 CE, what followed was a year of savage instability. 4 men claimed the throne in quick succession. 2 died violently. The Praetorian Guard, the imperial bodyguard, 10,000 soldiers stationed in Rome itself, actually auctioned the throne to the highest bidder at one point, a moment so brazenly corrupt that Roman historians recorded it with a kind of horrified disbelief. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus paid an enormous sum for the honor of being emperor. He lasted 66 days before being executed by the forces of a rival. This was new. This was something the Pax Romana had successfully suppressed for nearly a century, now surfacing again with a vengeance.
The dynasty that eventually stabilized things, the Severan dynasty, founded by Septimius Severus, who marched his Danubian legions to Rome and simply took the throne by force, lasted until 235 CE. It was a harder, more militarized empire than the one Marcus Aurelius had presided over. Septimius Severus, dying in York in northern Britain in 211 CE, is said to have given his sons a single piece of advice: enrich the soldiers and scorn everyone else. It was not the counsel of a man who believed in the old republican virtues. It was the counsel of a man who understood, with brutal clarity, where real power now resided. The soldiers. Always now, the soldiers.
Beneath the political turbulence, something else was changing, something slower and more fundamental. The Roman economy, which had expanded enormously during the centuries of conquest, was beginning to show the limits of a system built on continuous acquisition. The great conquests were largely over by the 2nd century. New provinces were not being added. New sources of slaves and tribute were not flowing in. The empire had reached, more or less, the boundaries it would keep, and an economy that had been built on expansion now had to sustain itself on consolidation. This is harder than it sounds. The cost of the military did not decrease with the end of major conquest. The cost of the bureaucracy grew as the empire became more complex to administer. The cost of the imperial court, of the games and the grain doles that kept the urban poor fed and entertained continued to accumulate, and the revenues that had funded all of this were no longer growing.
The Roman response to this fiscal pressure was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential financial decisions in ancient history. They debased the currency. The silver denarius, the standard coin of the Roman economy, bearing the emperor's portrait and circulating across the empire for centuries, was gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, reduced in its silver content. Under Augustus it had been nearly pure silver. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, it was bronze with a thin silver wash. The silver content had fallen from nearly 100% to perhaps 2 or 3. The effect was what any modern economist would predict: inflation. Prices rose. Savings lost their value. The fixed-income farmers and soldiers who depended on consistent purchasing power found their economic lives slowly eroding. Why did Rome fall? Here is an answer that has a very modern ring to it. It debased its currency to pay its bills, and the resulting inflation corroded the economic foundations of its middle and lower classes. The farmers who had once been the backbone of the Roman military could no longer reliably sustain themselves. The small merchants who had moved goods along those magnificent roads found the economics of trade increasingly uncertain. The system that had created shared prosperity across 50 million people was slowly losing its ability to deliver on that promise. Lie quietly with that thought. It is not a comfortable one, but it is worth holding. There was also, moving through the 2nd century, with the quiet devastation of something that does not announce itself: disease. The Antonine Plague, probably smallpox, arriving from the eastern campaigns of the 160 CE, swept through the empire in waves over 15 years, killing perhaps 5 million people. Some estimates go higher. Marcus Aurelius governed through it, corresponded about it, watched it thin his legions and empty his cities. And then, barely 50 years later, the plague of Cyprian arrived and stayed for nearly 20 years, killing at its height 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. The demographic damage was severe and slow to heal. Farmland went unworked, legions went undermanned, tax revenues fell. The empire continued because empires have enormous momentum, but it continued with less labor, less revenue, less resilience.
And yet, through all of this, Rome endured. That is the part that is easy to overlook when cataloging the pressures of the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, that the empire absorbed each of these shocks and continued to function. The roads were still maintained, the law was still administered, the legions still held the frontiers, the cities were still fed. It was a diminished, strained, more anxious version of the Pax Romana, but it was recognizably the same civilization, still holding its shape, still generating the daily rhythms of shared life across 3 continents. The foundation was cracked, but the building still stood. And from the inside, if you did not look too closely at the walls, it was possible to believe it would stand forever.
Let the image settle around you, a great structure in late afternoon light, its marble still gleaming, its proportions still magnificent, and somewhere in its base, invisible from the outside, a hair-lined fracture running through the stone. Not dramatic, not announced, just quietly present, deepening with each passing season, each added weight, each winter's freeze and summer's heat working patiently on the gap. Why did Rome fall? Because the cracks were real, even when no one could see them. Because systems under sustained pressure eventually reach a threshold, and what was gradual becomes sudden. Because the slow things are always the most consequential, not the fires and the assassinations and the dramatic crossings of rivers, but the quiet, invisible, underground work of forces that have no interest in being noticed. The building still stands tonight, the lamps are still burning, but in the foundations, in the dark, something is moving, and it has all the patience in the world. The interesting thing about a crack in a foundation is that it is almost never visible from the surface. The floor above it looks the same, the walls stand, the roof holds. People walk through the rooms of a building with a cracked foundation and feel nothing unusual beneath their feet. No trembling, no unevenness, no signal that anything is wrong. The crack works in silence and in darkness, slowly widening under the weight of everything above it, patient as geology, invisible until the morning it is not. Why did Rome fall? For most of the people living through the 2nd century of the Common Era, the question would have seemed absurd.
Rome was not falling, Rome was Rome, and yet in the foundations, something was shifting.
The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE marks for many historians a kind of invisible threshold, the moment the long afternoon of the Pax Romana began almost imperceptibly to cool. His son Commodus, as we have already visited, was the first sign. But Commodus was not the cause of what followed. He was more a symptom, a first expression of a structural problem that ran far deeper than any individual emperor's character. The problem was succession. The problem was, more precisely, that the empire had no reliable mechanism for it. A republic chooses its leaders annually through election and rotation. A hereditary monarchy at least offers the clarity of bloodline. The Roman Empire, in its strange hybrid form, offered neither, a system in which power passed through adoption, military acclaim, Senate approval, and occasionally simple murder, with no consistent principle to adjudicate between them.
After Commodus was strangled in his bath on the last night of 192 CE, what followed was a year of savage instability. 4 men claimed the throne in quick succession. 2 died violently. The Praetorian Guard, the imperial bodyguard, 10,000 soldiers stationed in Rome itself, actually auctioned the throne to the highest bidder at one point, a moment so brazenly corrupt that Roman historians recorded it with a kind of horrified disbelief. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus paid an enormous sum for the honor of being emperor. He lasted 66 days before being executed by the forces of a rival. This was new. This was something the Pax Romana had successfully suppressed for nearly a century, now surfacing again with a vengeance.
The dynasty that eventually stabilized things, the Severan dynasty, founded by Septimius Severus, who marched his Danubian legions to Rome and simply took the throne by force, lasted until 235 CE. It was a harder, more militarized empire than the one Marcus Aurelius had presided over. Septimius Severus, dying in York in northern Britain in 211 CE, is said to have given his sons a single piece of advice: enrich the soldiers and scorn everyone else. It was not the counsel of a man who believed in the old republican virtues. It was the counsel of a man who understood, with brutal clarity, where real power now resided. The soldiers. Always now, the soldiers.
Beneath the political turbulence, something else was changing, something slower and more fundamental. The Roman economy, which had expanded enormously during the centuries of conquest, was beginning to show the limits of a system built on continuous acquisition. The great conquests were largely over by the 2nd century. New provinces were not being added. New sources of slaves and tribute were not flowing in. The empire had reached, more or less, the boundaries it would keep, and an economy that had been built on expansion now had to sustain itself on consolidation. This is harder than it sounds. The cost of the military did not decrease with the end of major conquest. The cost of the bureaucracy grew as the empire became more complex to administer. The cost of the imperial court, of the games and the grain doles that kept the urban poor fed and entertained continued to accumulate, and the revenues that had funded all of this were no longer growing.
The Roman response to this fiscal pressure was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential financial decisions in ancient history. They debased the currency. The silver denarius, the standard coin of the Roman economy, bearing the emperor's portrait and circulating across the empire for centuries, was gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, reduced in its silver content. Under Augustus it had been nearly pure silver. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, it was bronze with a thin silver wash. The silver content had fallen from nearly 100% to perhaps 2 or 3. The effect was what any modern economist would predict: inflation. Prices rose. Savings lost their value. The fixed-income farmers and soldiers who depended on consistent purchasing power found their economic lives slowly eroding. Why did Rome fall? Here is an answer that has a very modern ring to it. It debased its currency to pay its bills, and the resulting inflation corroded the economic foundations of its middle and lower classes. The farmers who had once been the backbone of the Roman military could no longer reliably sustain themselves. The small merchants who had moved goods along those magnificent roads found the economics of trade increasingly uncertain. The system that had created shared prosperity across 50 million people was slowly losing its ability to deliver on that promise. Lie quietly with that thought. It is not a comfortable one, but it is worth holding.
There was also, moving through the 2nd century, with the quiet devastation of something that does not announce itself: disease. The Antonine Plague, probably smallpox, arriving from the eastern campaigns of the 160 CE, swept through the empire in waves over 15 years, killing perhaps 5 million people. Some estimates go higher. Marcus Aurelius governed through it, corresponded about it, watched it thin his legions and empty his cities. And then, barely 50 years later, the plague of Cyprian arrived and stayed for nearly 20 years, killing at its height 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. The demographic damage was severe and slow to heal. Farmland went unworked, legions went undermanned, tax revenues fell. The empire continued because empires have enormous momentum, but it continued with less labor, less revenue, less resilience.
And yet, through all of this, Rome endured. That is the part that is easy to overlook when cataloging the pressures of the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, that the empire absorbed each of these shocks and continued to function. The roads were still maintained, the law was still administered, the legions still held the frontiers, the cities were still fed. It was a diminished, strained, more anxious version of the Pax Romana, but it was recognizably the same civilization, still holding its shape, still generating the daily rhythms of shared life across 3 continents. The foundation was cracked, but the building still stood. And from the inside, if you did not look too closely at the walls, it was possible to believe it would stand forever.
Let the image settle around you. A great structure in late afternoon light, its marble still gleaming, its proportions still magnificent, and somewhere in its base, invisible from the outside, a hair-lined fracture running through the stone. Not dramatic, not announced, just quietly present, deepening with each passing season, each added weight, each winter's freeze and summer's heat working patiently on the gap. Why did Rome fall? Because the cracks were real, even when no one could see them. Because systems under sustained pressure eventually reach a threshold, and what was gradual becomes sudden. Because the slow things are always the most consequential, not the fires and the assassinations and the dramatic crossings of rivers, but the quiet, invisible, underground work of forces that have no interest in being noticed. The building still stands tonight, the lamps are still burning, but in the foundations, in the dark, something is moving, and it has all the patience in the world. There are moments in history when the accumulated pressures of decades, the slow work of forces that have been building quietly beneath the surface, finally find a way through. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once, in a cascade of events so rapid and so interconnected that the people living through them have no framework adequate to understand what is happening. They only know that the world they woke up in no longer resembles the world they went to sleep in, and that the distance between those 2 worlds keeps growing. Why did Rome fall? If any single period holds the clearest answer, it is the 50 years beginning in 235 CE. The Romans did not have a name for it while it was happening. Historians would eventually call it the crisis of the 3rd century. It was the closest Rome ever came to simply ceasing to exist. It began, as so many Roman crises began, with a soldier and a murder. The Emperor Severus Alexander, young, studious, considered by the Senate to be a reasonable and conscientious ruler, was killed by his own troops in 235 CE on the Rhine frontier. His soldiers felt he had been too cautious, too diplomatic, too reluctant to fight. They wanted a different kind of emperor. They wanted one of their own. They found him in a man named Maximinus Thrax, a Thracian of enormous physical size and reportedly humble origin, the first emperor to have never served in the Senate, never held a civil magistracy, never participated in the civic life of Rome in any conventional sense. He was a soldier, purely and entirely. He ruled like one. What followed Maximinus was 50 years of almost unrelenting instability. In that half-century, Rome had at least 26 emperors. Some sources count more, most of whom died violently, most of whom were proclaimed not by the Senate in Rome, but by frontier armies who had decided, with the simple logic of armed men, that their general ought to be running things. The average reign lasted less than 2 years. Several lasted weeks. One, Gordian I, lasted just 22 days before taking his own life upon learning of his son's death in battle. 26 emperors in 50 years. Let that settle quietly for a moment. That is an average of one new emperor every 23 months, each transition accompanied by varying degrees of civil war, military movement, and administrative disruption. But the internal chaos was only part of the crisis. At precisely the moment when Rome most needed stable governance and full military capacity, the external pressures on its borders intensified dramatically. On the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Germanic confederacies, the Alemanni, the Goths, the Franks, had grown larger, more organized, and more militarily sophisticated than the tribal groups Rome had faced in earlier centuries. They were no longer raiding parties. They were migrations, armies, peoples in motion, pressing against the empire's northern edge with a sustained pressure it had never experienced before. And in the east, the old Parthian Empire, Rome's traditional rival, familiar and in certain ways almost comfortable in its predictability, had been replaced by something new and considerably more dangerous. The Sassanid Persian Empire, founded in 224 CE, was aggressive, centralized, and deeply motivated by a sense of imperial destiny that matched Rome's own. The collision between Rome and the Sassanids produced one of the most shocking moments of the entire crisis, a moment so unprecedented that Roman writers struggled to find language adequate to describe it. In 260 CE, the Emperor Valerian led a Roman army against the Sassanid forces near the city of Edessa. The battle went badly. The Romans were surrounded, exhausted, and riddled with plague. And Valerian, the Emperor of Rome, the man who held the supreme power of the most formidable state in the Western world, was captured. Not killed, captured. Taken prisoner by the Sassanid Shah Shapur I, who is said to have used the Roman emperor as a mounting block when climbing onto his horse. Whether that particular detail is true or embellishment, the humiliation was real and enormous. A Roman emperor, alive and in enemy hands, was something the imperial system had no precedent for and no mechanism to absorb. Why did Rome fall? Here is an answer that arrives with unusual force. Because for 50 years it nearly fell completely, and the effort of not falling changed it permanently. The Rome that emerged from the crisis of the 3rd century was not the same Rome that entered it. The Senate's prestige had been further hollowed out. The connection between civilian governance and military command, already strained, had essentially severed. The economy, battered by decades of civil war and currency debasement and disrupted trade, was operating at a fraction of its former efficiency. The psychological confidence of a civilization that had believed itself eternal had been quietly, deeply shaken. And yet, and this is the part worth pausing on,
Rome survived. It is extraordinary when you catalog the full weight of what the 3rd century threw at the empire that it did not simply collapse entirely. Other states have fallen under lesser pressure. The Roman Empire, during its worst 50 years, held on. Barely, incompletely, with enormous cost, but it held. Part of the explanation is sheer institutional momentum. The roads still functioned, the law still applied in most places. The basic infrastructure of civilization was too deeply embedded to simply evaporate. Part of it is the remarkable series of soldier emperors in the latter part of the crisis, men like Claudius Gothicus and Aurelian, hard and capable and utterly without sentiment, who fought their way through the chaos and, by the 270s, had substantially restored the empire's territorial integrity.
Aurelian is perhaps the most underappreciated figure of the entire Roman story. He reigned for only 5 years, from 270 to 275 CE. But in those 5 years, he defeated the Alemanni on Italian soil, the first time a foreign army had reached Italy in centuries, reconquered the breakaway Eastern Palmyrene Empire, reconquered the breakaway Western Gallic Empire, rebuilt the walls of Rome itself, and stabilized the currency. He called himself Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. He was assassinated by his own officers before he could complete what he had started. Of course he was.
The walls Aurelian built around Rome are still standing. You can walk along sections of them today. 12 miles of brick and concrete, studded with towers, pierced by gates, rising to a height of 20 feet. They are extraordinary for many reasons, but perhaps most extraordinary for what they represent. For the first time in centuries, Rome felt it necessary to fortify itself. The city at the center of the world, the city from which all roads extended outward, the city that had always been the safe interior around which the empire wrapped its military might, that city now needed walls. Something fundamental had shifted. The center was no longer automatically safe. The world had moved closer.
Lie still and let the century of crisis move through you like a storm passing in the night. Its thunder and lightning real and terrible, its damage genuine, and yet by morning the sky beginning to clear. The storm did not destroy Rome, but it changed the air, changed the light, changed the way the stones felt underfoot, and the way people looked at the walls around them, and the way emperors understood the ground they stood on. Why did Rome fall? Because the century of crisis used up something that cannot easily be replenished. Not territory, not soldiers, not even money, but confidence. The quiet, bone-deep certainty that Rome was permanent, that its structures were unassailable, that the civilization at the center of the world was simply too large and too established to fail. That certainty had cracked in the 3rd century, and no amount of Aurelian's walls or Diocletian's reforms still to come would quite restore it to what it had been. The storm has passed. The walls are new. The emperor is rebuilding. But somewhere in the population of this enormous, exhausted, resilient empire, a new question has taken root. Quiet, unspoken. The kind of question people do not say aloud because saying it makes it more real. The question is simply, what if? And once that question exists, it never entirely goes away.
Consider for a moment the weight of the job. You are responsible for the safety and administration of a territory stretching from the Scottish lowlands to the Euphrates River. 50 million people, perhaps more, live under your authority. They speak dozens of languages. They worship hundreds of gods. They farm different soils, sail different seas, build in different materials, eat different food, and hold different ideas about what a good life looks like. And all of them, in some fundamental sense, depend on you, on your decisions, your appointments, your responses to crises that arrive without warning from directions you cannot always anticipate. Why did Rome fall? One answer is simply this: the job became impossible, and the men who held it were only human.
Diocletian understood this with unusual clarity. He came to power in 284 CE, at the end of the century of crisis, a soldier emperor from the Dalmatian coast with no distinguished ancestry and an extraordinarily practical mind. He looked at the empire he had inherited, battered, overstretched, administratively chaotic, and did something no emperor before him had seriously attempted. He decided that one man could not run it alone. His solution was the tetrarchy, the rule of four. Two senior emperors, each holding the title of Augustus, one governing the western half of the empire, one governing the eastern. Each Augustus supported by a junior emperor holding the title of Caesar, each Caesar designated as the eventual successor to his Augustus. 4 rulers, 4 courts, 4 capitals, 1 empire.
It was a remarkable piece of political engineering. Diocletian based himself not in Rome, which was by now too distant from the frontiers to serve as an effective command center, but in Nicomedia, in northwestern Asia Minor, closer to the eastern border. His co-emperor Maximian governed from Milan. The two Caesars operated from Trier on the Rhine and Sirmium on the Danube. Rome itself, the eternal city, the heart of the civilization, was no longer where the emperor lived. The symbolism of that shift was enormous, even if few people remarked on it at the time. The administrative logic was sound. The empire was simply too large and too threatened on too many frontiers simultaneously for one man in one place to govern effectively. 4 emperors meant 4 rapid response centers, 4 armies under direct imperial command, 4 sets of eyes on the borders.
Diocletian also undertook the most sweeping administrative reorganization in Roman history. He doubled the size of the bureaucracy. He reorganized the provinces, splitting the largest ones into smaller units, easier to administer, harder for any individual governor to use as a power base for rebellion. He reformed the tax system, attempting to put it on a more rational footing. He reformed the military, creating a mobile reserve force that could be moved quickly to wherever the crisis was, rather than keeping all troops permanently stationed on the frontier. Each of these reforms was sensible. Each of them also cost money, and the money had to come from somewhere, which meant taxes, and taxes meant pressure on the people least able to absorb it, which meant the farmers and the small merchants and the artisans, who were already struggling under the accumulated weight of decades of instability. Diocletian also attempted something that would prove both ambitious and illuminating in its failure. He tried to control prices. The Edict on Maximum Prices, issued in 301 CE, set legal maximums for hundreds of goods and services across the empire, from wheat and wine to haircuts and legal fees. The penalty for exceeding the set prices was death. It was one of the most comprehensive attempts at economic regulation in the ancient world. It did not work. Merchants simply stopped selling goods rather than sell at a loss. Shortages developed, black markets appeared. The edict was quietly abandoned within a few years, leaving behind only its text, preserved on stone inscriptions found across the empire, a monument to the gap between imperial ambition and economic reality.
Why did Rome fall? Here is a quiet answer from the reign of Diocletian. Because the solutions to its problems kept creating new problems. The expanded bureaucracy required more tax revenue. The tax revenue required more administrative capacity to collect. The administrative capacity required more bureaucrats. Each layer of solution added weight to a structure that was already bearing more than it had been designed to hold. The empire was, in a sense, governing itself to exhaustion, each rational response to a genuine problem generating its own secondary pressures. Diocletian did something else remarkable, something that no emperor before him had done voluntarily. In 305 CE, after 20 years of rule, he abdicated. He retired to a palace he had built for himself on the Dalmatian coast in what is now the Croatian city of Split. He grew cabbages. He is said to have responded to appeals that he returned to power by saying that if his former colleagues could see the cabbages he had raised with his own hands, they would never ask him to give up this happiness for the storms of an insatiable greed. It is one of the most human moments in the entire Roman story. The most powerful man in the Western world choosing vegetables over empire. Whether the contentment was genuine or performed, the image is worth holding. A man who understood the weight of the job and put it down. The Tetrarchy did not survive Diocletian's retirement. Within a few years, the careful system of succession he had designed collapsed entirely, as the sons and allies of the various emperors began fighting among themselves. By 312 CE, there were 6 men simultaneously claiming imperial power. The civil wars that followed were brutal and exhaustive, and they ended, as Roman civil wars had a way of ending, with one man left standing. His name was Constantine, and he would change the empire more fundamentally than any ruler since Augustus, not primarily through military conquest or administrative reform, but through an act of religious conversion whose consequences are still unfolding 15 centuries later. But before we follow Constantine into his transformation, let us stay a moment longer with the impossible job itself. Because what Diocletian's reign revealed, beneath all its practical reforms and administrative innovations, was a structural truth that the empire had been avoiding for a long time. Rome had grown beyond the capacity of any political system it knew how to build to govern it. The republican institutions had been designed for a city-state. The imperial system had been designed essentially by one man improvising under pressure. Neither was adequate to the reality of a multi-continental empire under sustained military threat. The job was impossible not because the men who held it were inadequate, some of them were extraordinary, but because the job itself had outgrown every tool available for doing it. Let that thought settle quietly as you drift. There is something almost restful in it. The recognition that some problems are genuinely too large for any individual solution. That the fall of Rome was not a failure of nerve or character, but the natural consequence of a system pushed past the boundaries of what any system can hold. The empire was not betrayed. It was not abandoned. It was simply asked to be more than anything had ever been asked to be before. Why did Rome fall? Because the job was impossible. And for a very long time, for centuries really, extraordinary human beings did the impossible job anyway, imperfectly and at enormous cost, and the civilization endured because of them. That is not a story of failure. That is, in its quiet way, one of the most remarkable stories in the whole of human history. Rest in that thought. The emperor has put down his burden and gone to tend his garden. The cabbages are growing in the Dalmatian sun. And somewhere to the north, a young general named Constantine is looking toward Rome with patient, calculating eyes. Consider for a moment the weight of the job. You are responsible for the safety and administration of a territory stretching from the Scottish lowlands to the Euphrates River. 50 million people, perhaps more, live under your authority. They speak dozens of languages. They worship hundreds of gods. They farm different soils, sail different seas, build in different materials, eat different food, and hold different ideas about what a good life looks like. And all of them, in some fundamental sense, depend on you, on your decisions, your appointments, your responses to crises that arrive without warning from directions you cannot always anticipate. Why did Rome fall? One answer is simply this: the job became impossible, and the men who held it were only human.
Diocletian understood this with unusual clarity. He came to power in 284 CE, at the end of the century of crisis, a soldier emperor from the Dalmatian coast with no distinguished ancestry and an extraordinarily practical mind. He looked at the empire he had inherited, battered, overstretched, administratively chaotic, and did something no emperor before him had seriously attempted. He decided that one man could not run it alone. His solution was the tetrarchy, the rule of four. Two senior emperors, each holding the title of Augustus, one governing the western half of the empire, one governing the eastern. Each Augustus supported by a junior emperor holding the title of Caesar, each Caesar designated as the eventual successor to his Augustus. 4 rulers, 4 courts, 4 capitals, 1 empire.
It was a remarkable piece of political engineering. Diocletian based himself not in Rome, which was by now too distant from the frontiers to serve as an effective command center, but in Nicomedia, in northwestern Asia Minor, closer to the eastern border. His co-emperor Maximian governed from Milan. The two Caesars operated from Trier on the Rhine and Sirmium on the Danube. Rome itself, the eternal city, the heart of the civilization, was no longer where the emperor lived. The symbolism of that shift was enormous, even if few people remarked on it at the time. The administrative logic was sound. The empire was simply too large and too threatened on too many frontiers simultaneously for one man in one place to govern effectively. 4 emperors meant 4 rapid response centers, 4 armies under direct imperial command, 4 sets of eyes on the borders.
Diocletian also undertook the most sweeping administrative reorganization in Roman history. He doubled the size of the bureaucracy. He reorganized the provinces, splitting the largest ones into smaller units, easier to administer, harder for any individual governor to use as a power base for rebellion. He reformed the tax system, attempting to put it on a more rational footing. He reformed the military, creating a mobile reserve force that could be moved quickly to wherever the crisis was, rather than keeping all troops permanently stationed on the frontier. Each of these reforms was sensible. Each of them also cost money, and the money had to come from somewhere, which meant taxes, and taxes meant pressure on the people least able to absorb it, which meant the farmers and the small merchants and the artisans, who were already struggling under the accumulated weight of decades of instability. Diocletian also attempted something that would prove both ambitious and illuminating in its failure. He tried to control prices. The Edict on Maximum Prices, issued in 301 CE, set legal maximums for hundreds of goods and services across the empire, from wheat and wine to haircuts and legal fees. The penalty for exceeding the set prices was death. It was one of the most comprehensive attempts at economic regulation in the ancient world. It did not work. Merchants simply stopped selling goods rather than sell at a loss. Shortages developed, black markets appeared. The edict was quietly abandoned within a few years, leaving behind only its text, preserved on stone inscriptions found across the empire, a monument to the gap between imperial ambition and economic reality.
Why did Rome fall? Here is a quiet answer from the reign of Diocletian. Because the solutions to its problems kept creating new problems. The expanded bureaucracy required more tax revenue. The tax revenue required more administrative capacity to collect. The administrative capacity required more bureaucrats. Each layer of solution added weight to a structure that was already bearing more than it had been designed to hold. The empire was, in a sense, governing itself to exhaustion, each rational response to a genuine problem generating its own secondary pressures. Diocletian did something else remarkable, something that no emperor before him had done voluntarily. In 305 CE, after 20 years of rule, he abdicated. He retired to a palace he had built for himself on the Dalmatian coast in what is now the Croatian city of Split. He grew cabbages. He is said to have responded to appeals that he returned to power by saying that if his former colleagues could see the cabbages he had raised with his own hands, they would never ask him to give up this happiness for the storms of an insatiable greed. It is one of the most human moments in the entire Roman story. The most powerful man in the Western world choosing vegetables over empire. Whether the contentment was genuine or performed, the image is worth holding. A man who understood the weight of the job and put it down. The Tetrarchy did not survive Diocletian's retirement. Within a few years, the careful system of succession he had designed collapsed entirely, as the sons and allies of the various emperors began fighting among themselves. By 312 CE, there were 6 men simultaneously claiming imperial power. The civil wars that followed were brutal and exhaustive, and they ended, as Roman civil wars had a way of ending, with one man left standing. His name was Constantine, and he would change the empire more fundamentally than any ruler since Augustus, not primarily through military conquest or administrative reform, but through an act of religious conversion whose consequences are still unfolding 15 centuries later. But before we follow Constantine into his transformation, let us stay a moment longer with the impossible job itself. Because what Diocletian's reign revealed, beneath all its practical reforms and administrative innovations, was a structural truth that the empire had been avoiding for a long time. Rome had grown beyond the capacity of any political system it knew how to build to govern it. The republican institutions had been designed for a city-state. The imperial system had been designed essentially by one man improvising under pressure. Neither was adequate to the reality of a multi-continental empire under sustained military threat. The job was impossible not because the men who held it were inadequate, some of them were extraordinary, but because the job itself had outgrown every tool available for doing it. Let that thought settle quietly as you drift. There is something almost restful in it. The recognition that some problems are genuinely too large for any individual solution. That the fall of Rome was not a failure of nerve or character, but the natural consequence of a system pushed past the boundaries of what any system can hold. The empire was not betrayed. It was not abandoned. It was simply asked to be more than anything had ever been asked to be before. Why did Rome fall? Because the job was impossible. And for a very long time, for centuries really, extraordinary human beings did the impossible job anyway, imperfectly and at enormous cost, and the civilization endured because of them. That is not a story of failure. That is, in its quiet way, one of the most remarkable stories in the whole of human history. Rest in that thought. The emperor has put down his burden and gone to tend his garden. The cabbages are growing in the Dalmatian sun. And somewhere to the north, a young general named Constantine is looking toward Rome with patient, calculating eyes.
Every empire in history has had to answer the same quiet questions sooner or later. Not loudly, not in a single moment of reckoning, but in 1,000 small budget decisions, 1,000 troop deployments, 1,000 arguments between the men who wanted to spend and the men who had to find the money. The question is simply this: how do you pay for the army that keeps you safe without destroying the economy that makes the army possible?
Rome wrestled with this question for centuries, and it never entirely solved it. Why did Rome fall? Part of the answer is denominated in silver, in grain, in the annual cost of keeping 300,000 armed men fed, equipped, paid, and loyal on the edges of a world that kept finding new ways to press inward. At the height of the Pax Romana, Rome maintained a professional standing army of roughly 300,000 soldiers, the legions and their auxiliary units, distributed along the frontiers in permanent fortified bases. It was an extraordinary military achievement, the first truly professional, full-time standing army in Western history. Each soldier trained to a consistent standard, equipped from imperial workshops, paid a regular salary, and entitled to a veteran's land grant upon honorable discharge after 25 years of service. It was also extraordinarily expensive. Military expenditure consumed somewhere between half and three-quarters of the entire imperial budget. Every road, every aqueduct, every public building, every grain dole, every administrative salary, all of it together cost less than the army. For a long time, the math worked. The legions were not merely a cost, they were an investment. They conquered territories that paid tribute. They suppressed rebellions that would have been far more expensive unsuppressed. They maintained the conditions of the Pax Romana that made the trade and agricultural production possible, and it was that trade and production that generated the tax revenue that paid the soldiers. The army and the economy fed each other in a circular logic that worked as long as both kept growing. But empires, as we have already seen, do not grow forever, and an army sized for expansion becomes, in a period of consolidation, simply a cost.
The soldiers themselves changed over the centuries in ways that are easy to overlook but deeply consequential. The early legions had been drawn from Roman citizens, men with a stake in the system, farmers and artisans who fought for something they understood as their own. As the empire expanded and the citizen base proved insufficient to fill the ranks, recruitment spread first to Italian allies, then to provincial subjects, then increasingly to men recruited from the very frontier peoples the legions were meant to hold back. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, a significant portion of the Roman army was composed of Germanic soldiers, men who had been recruited from tribes beyond the frontier, who fought effectively and loyally for the most part, but whose relationship to Roman civilization was fundamentally different from the farmers of Latium who had filled the early legions. They were professionals, mercenaries in the modern sense of the word. Their loyalty was to their commander and their pay.
The pay was the problem, or more precisely, what happened when the pay was late, or debased, or simply insufficient to keep pace with the inflation that currency debasement had unleashed. A soldier who is not paid is not a soldier. He is an armed, trained, hungry man with a very practical understanding of where the wealth is and how to get it. Roman history is filled with armies that turned on their commanders, on their emperors, on the cities they were supposed to protect when the economic bargain broke down. The Marian reforms of the late Republic had bound soldiers' loyalty to their generals rather than to the state. The 3rd century crisis had demonstrated what that meant in practice, and by the 4th century, keeping the legions loyal required an ever-escalating investment, higher pay, larger donatives on the emperor's accession and anniversaries, more lavish provisions that the treasury was increasingly hard-pressed to meet. Why did Rome fall? Here is a very old answer and a very modern-sounding one. It could not sustain the military spending required to defend its borders without hollowing out the economy that made the spending possible. The taxes required to fund the army fell most heavily on the agricultural population, the farmers and smallholders, who were least able to absorb them, and whose productivity was already being squeezed by plague and labor shortage and the disruptions of civil war. Higher taxes meant less investment in the land. Less investment meant lower yields. Lower yields meant lower tax revenues. Lower revenues meant more pressure on the remaining taxpayers. The spiral was slow, but it was consistent. Diocletian's military reforms had attempted to address this by creating a distinction between the frontier legions, the limitani, permanent garrison troops stationed along the borders, and a mobile central reserve, the comitatensis, that could be moved quickly to respond to crises anywhere in the empire. It was a logical innovation, and it improved tactical flexibility considerably. But it also effectively doubled the size of the military establishment required to defend the same territory, because you needed both the frontier garrison and the mobile reserve simultaneously. More soldiers, more cost. The math kept getting harder.
There is a detail from the late Roman military that carries, in its small way, the weight of everything we have been discussing. In the 4th and 5th centuries, as the empire struggled to find enough soldiers and enough money to pay them, it became increasingly common to settle entire barbarian groups, Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, inside imperial territory in exchange for military service. These groups, called foederati, fought for Rome under their own commanders, under their own organizational structures, according to their own customs. They were not legionaries. They were allied forces, technically, but they were operating inside the empire, on its soil, under arrangements that gave Rome military capacity it needed and could no longer generate from its own population. It worked as a military solution for a time. As a political arrangement, it planted something inside the empire that would, eventually, grow in directions no one had planned.
Let the image of those foederati settle quietly. Gothic horsemen on Italian soil, Frankish infantry on the Rhine, Vandal cavalry in North Africa, all wearing the insignia of Rome, all fighting under Roman eagles, all receiving Roman pay in Roman coin. From one angle, it looks like the old story of Roman incorporation, the empire absorbing the peoples it could not exclude, turning potential enemies into soldiers, expanding the definition of Rome one more time. From another angle, it looks like something else. It looks like the inside of the empire beginning very slowly to resemble the outside. Why did Rome fall? Because the boundary between Rome and not Rome became over centuries harder and harder to locate. Drift with that thought for a moment. The boundary dissolving, not violently, not suddenly, but gradually, the way a shoreline changes, not in a single storm, but in 1,000 tides, each one moving the sand slightly, imperceptibly, until one morning you look up and the landscape is different, and you cannot point to the exact moment it changed. The legions are still marching tonight, the eagles are still carried, the standards still catch the light, but the men carrying them have changed, and the men they answer to have changed, and the world they are defending has changed. And the cost, always the cost, keeps rising, and the treasury keeps straining, and the farmers in their fields keep paying, and the question that was planted in the 3rd century, the quiet what if, keeps growing in the dark soil of a civilization that is still, unmistakably, Rome, and yet is becoming, with every passing generation, something it has never quite been before. The legions march, the torches burn, and the long, slow transformation continues, patient as the turning of seasons, deep in the night. There are forces that shape civilization so slowly, so far beneath the threshold of daily awareness, that no one living through them ever writes them down. No Roman senator stood before his colleagues and said, "The climate is shifting." No emperor issued an edict about the cooling of temperatures across the northern provinces, or the changing patterns of rainfall in North Africa, or the droughts that were quietly reshaping the agricultural productivity of regions that had fed the empire for generations. These things were not invisible. Their effects were felt everywhere,
in harvests and famines and the slow movement of peoples, but they had no name, no author, no villain to blame. Why did Rome fall? Some of the deepest answers are written not in the histories of emperors and battles, but in the ice cores of Greenland and the pollen records of ancient lake beds, where the climate of the ancient world is preserved in silence.
The Roman Empire rose during an unusually favorable period of climate history. Scientists studying ancient climate records have identified what they call the Roman climate optimum, a period of roughly 5 centuries from around 200 BCE to 150 CE, during which the Mediterranean world enjoyed unusually warm, stable, and wet conditions. Summers were warm but not brutal. Winters were mild. Rainfall was reliable. The agricultural engine that fed the empire, the grain fields of North Africa, the olive groves of Spain and Greece, the vineyards of Gaul and Italy, operated under conditions close to ideal. This was not luck in any simple sense, but it was a gift, and like all gifts, its value became most apparent when it was withdrawn.
Around the middle of the 2nd century CE, precisely at the moment when the other pressures on the empire were beginning to accumulate, the climate began to shift. Slowly at first, then with increasing consistency over the following centuries, temperatures across the northern hemisphere declined. Glaciers advanced. Growing seasons shortened, particularly in the northern provinces. Rainfall patterns became less reliable across the Mediterranean. The Roman climate optimum, which had been the invisible foundation beneath 5 centuries of agricultural abundance, was ending. The timing was, from Rome's perspective, catastrophic. The empire was already absorbing the shocks of the Antonine Plague, the beginning of the 3rd century crisis, the strains of military overextension. Now the agricultural base that generated the revenue that paid for all of it was becoming less reliable, year by year, harvest by harvest.
North Africa is the clearest example. The provinces of what are now Tunisia and Libya were in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE among the most productive agricultural regions in the known world. They supplied perhaps a third of the grain consumed by the city of Rome. The landscape was not the desert we might picture today. It was a cultivated, irrigated, densely settled agricultural zone, its productivity maintained by a sophisticated system of water management that the Romans had engineered over generations. But that productivity was always, at its margins, dependent on reliable rainfall. As the climate shifted and rainfall became less consistent, the margins began to fail. Fields that had been productive for centuries became marginal. Marginal fields became unworkable. The empire's breadbasket was quietly, imperceptibly beginning to shrink.
In the northern provinces, Britain, Gaul, the Rhineland, a different version of the same problem played out. These were regions that had only become fully agriculturally productive under Roman management, their forests cleared and their wetlands drained during the warm centuries of the Roman climate optimum. As temperatures cooled, their growing seasons shortened, harvests became less reliable. The population that had grown during the centuries of abundance found itself, slowly, with less to eat. And population pressure, the pressure of people who need more land than the climate is currently providing, is one of the most reliable generators of migration and conflict in all of human history. The peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube were not pressing against Rome's borders merely out of aggression or ambition. Many of them were being pushed by the same climatic forces that were stressing the empire from within.
Why did Rome fall? Here is an answer that belongs to no single person, carries no moral weight, and admits no simple solution. The climate that had quietly supported Rome's rise became, over the course of 2 centuries, measurably less supportive. The agricultural surplus that had funded the legions and the bureaucracy, and the grain doles and the spectacular public buildings, began at its edges to thin,
and an empire operating at the margins of its fiscal capacity, as Rome was by the 3rd century, has very little buffer against a sustained reduction in agricultural output. The climate did not destroy Rome, but it removed piece by piece the cushion that had allowed Rome to absorb every other pressure.
There is also the question of volcanic activity. The period from roughly 250 to 600 CE saw an unusual cluster of large volcanic eruptions, their signatures preserved in ice cores as sulfur deposits, their effects felt in the atmosphere as temporary coolings, their agricultural consequences measured in the tree rings of ancient forests that record the years of poor growth. Each eruption was temporary, lasting a year or two, but their clustering in precisely the period when Rome was already weakest meant that the recovery time between agricultural shocks kept shrinking. A civilization with full granaries and a functioning economy can absorb a year of poor harvest without lasting damage. A civilization already strained can be pushed by that same poor harvest into a cascade of consequences: debt, tax default, abandoned farms, reduced military capacity, that takes years to recover from, if recovery comes at all.
It is worth pausing here to appreciate the strangeness of what we are doing, lying in the quiet dark, letting the deep history of a civilization move through us like water, touching the places where the human story intersects with the geological story, the biological story, the atmospheric story. Rome was not only a political entity, it was a living system embedded in a physical world that had its own pace and its own priorities, entirely indifferent to the ambitions of emperors or the decisions of senates. The ice cores of Greenland do not know that they are recording the fall of Rome. They are simply doing what ice does, preserving, layer by layer, the chemistry of every year's atmosphere, the sulfur of distant volcanoes, the pollen of vanished forests, the isotopic signature of temperatures that no living person will ever feel.
What the climate record ultimately suggests is something that changes the shape of the story we tell about Rome's fall. It was not primarily a story of weakness, or corruption, or the failure of Roman virtue, or the inevitable decay of greatness. It was a story of a civilization that had been built on a particular set of conditions: political, military, economic, and environmental, and that those conditions, over the course of several centuries, changed. The political conditions changed, the military conditions changed, the economic conditions changed, and the environmental conditions changed. All of them, together, in the same direction, in the same centuries. No civilization, however brilliantly governed, however militarily capable, however culturally resilient, survives the simultaneous adverse movement of all its foundational conditions. Rome came closer than almost any other has.
Let the deep time of it settle over you now. The ice cores and the pollen and the tree rings and the volcanic ash, all of it accumulating in the dark of the earth while Rome went about its business above, building its marble temples and maintaining its roads and arguing about taxes and debating theology and training its soldiers and burying its dead. The earth was keeping its own record, in its own language, at its own pace. And the record it kept is patient and complete and utterly without judgment. Why did Rome fall? Because the world it was built for slowly became a different world. Because the climate that had quietly supported 5 centuries of abundance began, just as quietly, to withdraw. Because the ground beneath the foundations shifted. Not the political ground, not the military ground, but the actual ground, the soil, and the rainfall, and the length of the growing season,
and the temperature of the Mediterranean summer. The earth turns. The seasons change. The ice remembers everything. And somewhere in the long, patient dark of deep history, Rome is still falling. And still, in certain lights, still standing. Let that paradox carry you gently now, like a current beneath still water, toward sleep.
There is a particular kind of loss that history finds difficult to record. Not the loss of battles, or the fall of cities, or the deaths of emperors. Those things leave traces, documents, monuments, coins, the physical residue of consequence. But the loss of ordinary people, the farmer who did not plant his field in the spring because he was too ill, the child who did not grow up to become a soldier or a taxpayer or a parent, the street in a provincial town that went quiet one summer and never quite recovered its noise. That kind of loss is harder to find in the record. It lives in the silences, in the gaps between the data points, in the fields that stopped being tended and the houses that stopped being repaired. Why did Rome fall? Some of the answer lives in those silences, in the bodies that were never counted because there was no one left to count them.
The Roman Empire was struck by at least 2 catastrophic pandemics during the centuries of its long decline, and possibly a third, arriving just as the Western Empire breathed its last. The first, the Antonine Plague, arrived in the 160s CE, carried back from the eastern campaigns of the co-emperors Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius. It moved through the empire in waves for 15 years, killing perhaps 5 million people, possibly significantly more. The physician Galen, who lived through it, described symptoms that modern epidemiologists believe are consistent with smallpox: fever, diarrhea, skin eruptions, the particular progression of a disease that the Mediterranean world had never encountered before and had no immunity against. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it in his Meditations with the same quiet stoicism he brought to everything, acknowledging death, accepting impermanence, continuing to govern. The empire continued around the plague the way a river continues around a stone.
The second pandemic was the Plague of Cyprian, named for the Christian bishop of Carthage who wrote about it with unusual clinical detail. It arrived around 249 CE, precisely at the beginning of the century of crisis, and persisted for nearly 20 years. Some sources suggest it killed 5,000 people a day in Rome alone at its height. Cyprian's description of the symptoms is more disturbing than Galen's account of the Antonine Plague. Bloody diarrhea, vomiting, eyes inflamed with blood, extremities gangrenous, and overwhelming physical deterioration that modern researchers have variously attributed to a hemorrhagic fever, a filovirus, or a particularly severe strain of pandemic influenza. The identification does not matter as much as the scale. 20 years, 5,000 a day. Do the arithmetic slowly, in the dark, and let the number settle.
What the plagues did to Roman society went far beyond the immediate death toll, devastating as that was. They disrupted the deep, slow rhythms on which agricultural civilization depends. A farm requires continuous labor across seasons, the plowing and planting and irrigation and harvest that cannot be postponed without consequence. When plague moved through a farming community, it did not pause for the growing season. Fields went unplanted. Harvests rotted unharvested. Irrigation channels silted up when the people who maintained them were gone. And once an agricultural system falls below a certain threshold of labor, it does not simply produce less. It can collapse entirely, leaving nothing for the following year. The tax revenue followed the agriculture downward. The military recruitment followed the tax revenue. Everything was connected, and the disease moved through those connections like fire through dry wood.
The plagues also had a profound and largely invisible effect on the Roman military. The legions were not immune. They were, in fact, particularly vulnerable, as large concentrations of men living in close quarters under physical stress, moving across the empire along the same roads that carried the disease. The Antonine Plague so depleted the legions that Marcus Aurelius was forced to recruit gladiators and slaves to fill the ranks, a measure so desperate and so unprecedented that it was recorded by contemporaries as a sign of genuine crisis. The military capacity that Rome needed precisely when external pressure was increasing was being quietly consumed by something no sword could fight.
Why did Rome fall? Here is an answer that carries no political or moral content whatsoever. It fell, in part, because invisible things killed millions of its people at precisely the moments when those people were most needed. The plagues did not choose their timing. They did not target Rome specifically. They moved through the human world with the same indifference as the climate, following the roads and the trade routes and the concentration of population, finding the dense and the connected and the immunologically naive, and burning through them with a thoroughness that no emperor could legislate against and no general could defeat in the field. There is something worth sitting with gently in the darkness. The way the Roman response to the plagues reveals so much about the civilization's character. The official response was largely religious: sacrifices to the gods, consultations of oracles, the issuance of divine protection. This was not superstition in any simple sense. It was the Roman civilization doing what all civilizations do when confronted with forces beyond their understanding, reaching for the frameworks of meaning available to them. Marcus Aurelius ordered sacrifices. Diocletian, facing a later outbreak, ordered prayers. The gods were asked to do what the medicine could not. And in the gaps left by the official religion, something else was quietly growing, a faith that offered a different kind of comfort to the sick and the dying. We will come to that in later chapters, but its roots are here, in the plague years, in the wards and the streets and the countryside, where people were dying and looking for something to hold on to. The third major pandemic, the plague of Justinian, belongs technically to the Byzantine period, arriving in 541 CE, nearly a century after the conventional end of the Western Empire. But it is worth touching here because it completes a picture. This plague was almost certainly bubonic, the first recorded appearance of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would return 8 centuries later as the Black Death. It killed perhaps 25 million people across the Mediterranean world. It arrived just as the Eastern Emperor Justinian was making his most ambitious attempt to reconquer the lost Western provinces. The plague ended that ambition more effectively than any barbarian army could have. Some things are simply larger than the plans of emperors. Lie quietly and let the scale of it move through you, not with horror, but with the particular kind of stillness that very large numbers eventually produce. Millions of people across centuries living and dying in a world that did not understand what was killing them, tending their fields and raising their children and paying their taxes and serving in their legions between the waves of something they could not see and could not name, and the civilization continuing around them, absorbing each loss, finding ways to function with less, adapting and persisting, and eventually, gradually, becoming something different than it had been. Why did Rome fall? Because it was made of people, and people are fragile in ways that marble and law and military organization cannot protect against. The plagues remind us of this with a directness that no political history can quite match. That underneath all the grand architecture of civilization, the decisions of senators and the campaigns of generals and the reforms of emperors, there are just human bodies, warm, vulnerable, mortal human bodies, and sometimes the world is simply too much for them. Let that thought be gentle, not heavy. There is no despair in it, only the recognition of what it means to be alive in a physical world. The Romans knew this. They built their civilization in full awareness of death, carved memento mori into their feasting halls, kept skulls on their dinner tables as reminders that the feast was temporary. They understood impermanence better than most civilizations have, and they built anyway, built the roads and the aqueducts and the law codes and the literature, knowing it would not last forever, knowing the plague was always somewhere on the horizon, knowing the world was indifferent to their ambitions. That is not failure. That is courage of a very quiet, very ordinary, very human kind. The courage of people who plant fields knowing the harvest is not guaranteed, who build cities knowing cities fall, who love knowing loss is coming, who sleep eventually knowing they will wake, or perhaps one night will not. The lamps burn low. The city breathes. Somewhere outside the walls, the dark is very still.
Every border is, in the end, a fiction, a line drawn on the ground by people who believe they can determine, by agreement or by force, where one world ends and another begins. The Roman frontier was the most elaborate version of this fiction the ancient world had ever produced. Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britain, the Rhine and the Danube across the breadth of Europe, the eastern limes stretching through Syria and Arabia toward Mesopotamia. Thousands of miles of fortification, garrison, watchtower, and ditch, maintained at enormous expense, holding in place a boundary between what Rome called civilization and what it called, with a word whose condescension has echoed down the centuries, barbarism. Why did Rome fall? Because the border was always a fiction, and eventually the fiction became too expensive to maintain. The peoples beyond Rome's northern frontier were not, by the 4th century, the relatively simple tribal groups that Julius Caesar had encountered in Gaul, or that Augustus had fought in the forests beyond the Rhine. 3 centuries of contact with Rome had changed them profoundly. They had absorbed Roman military techniques, Roman organizational methods, Roman metallurgy. They traded with Rome, served in Rome's armies, received Roman subsidies, married into Roman families. They knew the empire intimately, its roads, its supply systems, its political vulnerabilities, in the way that only neighbors who have watched something carefully for a very long time can know it. They were not the other. They were, in many ways, a version of Rome that Rome had created without quite intending to.
The Goths are the clearest example. By the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, the Gothic peoples, divided broadly into the Visigoths to the west and the Ostrogoths to the east, had settled in the broad plains north of the Danube and the Black Sea. They were organized, militarily capable, and in increasingly complex political relationship with the empire. Gothic soldiers served in Roman armies. Gothic leaders received Roman titles. The boundary between Gothic and Roman identity was, for many individuals living in the frontier zone, genuinely unclear. And then, in the 370 CE, something arrived from the east that changed everything, something that even the Goths could not absorb or accommodate, something that moved faster than news could travel and struck harder than any force the frontier zone had ever experienced. The Huns. They arrived from the Eurasian steppe in the 370s with a speed and a ferocity that the settled peoples of Eastern Europe had no framework for understanding. Expert horsemen, mobile beyond anything the Roman military was designed to counter, they shattered the Ostrogothic Confederacy almost immediately and turned the Visigoths, who had been settled, farming neighbors of Rome for generations, into refugees overnight. 200,000 people, perhaps more, arrived at the Danube frontier in 376 CE and asked to be let in. The Emperor Valens said yes, It was a reasonable decision, in theory. The empire needed soldiers, the Goths were capable fighters, the arrangement of votarati was well established, but the implementation was catastrophic. Roman officials exploited the desperate Gothic refugees, selling them inedible food at extortionate prices, taking their children as slaves in exchange for dog meat. Within 2 years, the Goths were not grateful refugees. They were a furious, armed, well-organized population inside the empire with nothing left to lose.
At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, the Visigothic forces met the Eastern Roman army under Emperor Valens in what became one of the most consequential military engagements in Western history. The Roman army was destroyed. 2/3 of the Eastern field army died in the battle or in the rout that followed. The Emperor Valens himself was killed, the second Roman emperor to die at the hands of a foreign enemy, after Valerian's capture by the Sassanids a century earlier. Adrianople did not end the empire, but it demonstrated something the empire could not undemonstrate, that a barbarian force operating inside Roman territory could defeat a Roman army in open battle. The psychological weight of that demonstration was enormous and permanent.
Why did Rome fall? Here is an answer that takes the full measure of Adrianople. Not because the barbarians were stronger than Rome, but because Rome had, through a century of fiscal and demographic strain, lost the capacity to maintain the military superiority that had always been the ultimate guarantor of the frontier. The legions of the 4th century were not inferior to the legions of the 2nd. They were, if anything, more experienced and more battle-hardened. But they were too few, too thinly spread, too inadequately supplied, fighting enemies who had spent generations learning exactly how they operated. The border did not fail because the soldiers were cowardly. It failed because the math had finally caught up with everything else. The decades after Adrianople saw a fundamental renegotiation of the relationship between the empire and the peoples on and beyond its borders. The Visigoths were settled inside the empire as autonomous allies, not absorbed, not Romanized in the traditional sense, but present, armed, and operating under their own leadership within imperial territory. It was an arrangement born of necessity, and it worked, imperfectly, for a generation. Then in 410 CE, under their leader Alaric, the Visigoths sacked Rome. Not a burning, not a massacre. By the standards of ancient warfare, it was a relatively restrained 3 days of looting. But the psychological impact was incalculable. Rome had not been entered by a hostile force in 800 years. The eternal city, the center of the world, the city whose name was synonymous with civilization itself, had been sacked.
St. Augustine, writing in North Africa in the years after the sack, described the spiritual crisis it produced in the Roman world. People who had believed Rome was protected by its gods, or protected by the Christian God who had recently become its official deity, found both faiths shaken by the sight of Goths in the Forum. Augustine's response, The City of God, one of the most influential books in Western history, argued that the earthly city was always temporary, always fallen, always insufficient, and that the only city worth investing hope in was a heavenly one. It was a response that would shape Western thought for 1,000 years, and it began, in part, as a way of making sense of an empire that could no longer protect its own capital.
The peoples who crossed Rome's borders in the 4th and 5th centuries were not a single force with a single purpose. They were Visigoths and Ostrogoths, Vandals and Burgundians, Franks and Saxons and Angles, dozens of distinct groups with distinct histories, distinct languages, distinct relationships to Rome and to each other. What they shared was not a common identity, but a common circumstance. They were all, in various ways, displaced by the pressure from the East, drawn by the wealth of the empire, and emboldened by its demonstrated inability to stop them. And, crucially,
Most of them did not want to destroy Rome. They wanted to be Rome. They wanted the roads and the law and the grain and the prestige. They wanted to wear the purple, or at least to stand close enough to it to feel its warmth.
Let that settle quietly as you drift towards sleep. The barbarians at the gates were not, for the most part, Rome's enemies. They were Rome's students, Rome's soldiers, Rome's trading partners, Rome's neighbors, across a border that had always been more permeable than the walls suggested. They crossed not to extinguish the flame, but to warm themselves by it. And in warming themselves, they changed it. And in changing it, they carried it forward, into the medieval kingdoms of Europe, into the legal systems and the Latin languages and the church hierarchies that would shape the next 1,000 years. Why did Rome fall? Perhaps because it was too attractive to be kept outside. Perhaps because the border was always, at its deepest, not a wall, but an invitation. And eventually, the people standing on the cold side of it simply accepted. The wall is down now. The night is quiet. The fire still burns, somewhere in the dark, small and warm and persistent. Let it carry you gently the rest of the way into sleep.
There are moments in history when a single decision made by a single person in a single place under circumstances that can never be fully reconstructed changes the direction of everything that follows so completely that it becomes impossible to imagine the world without it. These moments are rarer than historians sometimes suggest. Most of what we call turning points are really the visible crests of waves whose deep motion had been building for a long time. But occasionally the individual and the moment align in a way that genuinely redirects the current of history. Constantine's conversion to Christianity is one of those moments, and like all such moments, it is surrounded by uncertainty, ambiguity, and the long shadow of everything it caused. Why did Rome fall? To answer that question honestly, we must first ask, what did Rome become? And to answer that, we must follow Constantine to a bridge outside Rome on an autumn afternoon in 312 CE.
The Battle of Milvian Bridge was, militarily, a relatively straightforward affair. Constantine's forces against those of his rival Maxentius fought at a crossing of the Tiber just north of Rome. Constantine won. Maxentius drowned in the river, his body found later in the mud. The victory gave Constantine control of the Western Empire and set him on the path to eventually ruling the whole. What made it extraordinary was not the battle, but the story Constantine told about what happened before it. He claimed, and the claim grew more elaborate in subsequent tellings, that on the eve of the battle he had received a divine sign. A vision of the Christian cross, or the Christian Chi-Rho symbol, in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." He had ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, and he had won.
Whether Constantine experienced a genuine religious conversion, or whether his embrace of Christianity was primarily a political calculation of extraordinary shrewdness, is a question that historians have debated for 17 centuries and will probably never resolve. The honest answer is likely that it was both, that for a man of the ancient world, the political and the spiritual were not as cleanly separable as they appear to modern minds, and that a military victory following a religious vision was, to Constantine and to everyone around him, simultaneously a sign of genuine divine favor and a demonstration of which God's patronage was most worth cultivating. What is not debatable are the consequences. Within a year of Milvian Bridge, Constantine and his eastern co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious toleration throughout the empire. Christianity, which had been intermittently persecuted for 3 centuries, was now legal, and within Constantine's own court and patronage network, it was becoming something considerably more than merely legal.
The church that Constantine adopted was not a small or politically insignificant institution. 3 centuries of persecution had, paradoxically, created a Christianity that was extraordinarily well organized, networked, disciplined, practiced in the administration of communities under pressure. Its bishops constituted a parallel administrative structure that, in certain respects, mirrored the Roman provincial system. Its congregations reached into every city, every social class, every corner of the empire. It had, in the language of a later age, institutional infrastructure. Constantine recognized this with the same practical clarity he brought to military affairs. The church was not just a religion, it was a network, and a network properly cultivated and properly aligned with imperial interests was an instrument of governance. He built. Churches rose across the empire with imperial funding: the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, grand structures that announced in marble and gold the new alignment between earthly and heavenly power. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, bringing together bishops from across the empire to resolve doctrinal disputes, treating the internal disagreements of the Christian community as matters of imperial concern, because a divided church was, to Constantine, a divided empire. He moved his capital. In 330 CE, he dedicated a new city on the site of the Greek colony of Byzantium, at the straits between Europe and Asia, a position of extraordinary strategic value, controlling the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. He called it Constantinople. It would endure as a capital for over 1,000 years. Why did Rome fall? Here is an answer that is genuinely complicated and worth holding carefully. The Christianization of the empire changed what the empire was for. The old Roman state had been, in its deepest identity, a civic and military enterprise. Its gods were gods of the city and the army. Its rituals were rituals of collective political life. Its highest values were the public virtues of service and sacrifice and military honor. The new Christian empire was oriented differently, toward salvation, toward the next world, toward a vision of human existence in which the earthly city was always secondary to the heavenly one. This did not weaken Rome in any simple or direct way, but it changed the question the civilization was asking of itself, and that change had consequences.
The Christian empire that Constantine founded was also, almost immediately, a theologically divided empire. The Council of Nicaea had attempted to resolve the Arian controversy, the question of whether Christ was of the same substance as God the Father, or merely similar, and had produced the Nicene Creed as its answer. But the controversy did not end with the council. It persisted for decades, with successive emperors taking different sides, entire provinces aligned with one theological position or another, and bishops wielding political influence in ways that the old republican system had never anticipated or accommodated. The empire that had once debated tax rates and military strategy now also debated the nature of the Trinity. Both debates were, in their way, about power, but they were not the same kind of debate, and they did not draw on the same capacities.
Constantine himself was baptized only on his deathbed in 337 CE, a common practice at the time, since baptism was believed to wash away all previous sins, and a man who delayed baptism until the end of his life arrived at death maximally clean. Whether this reflects a lingering ambivalence about full Christian commitment, or simply the conventional piety of the age, is another question that cannot be definitively answered. He died as he had lived, in the complicated middle ground between the old world and the new, neither fully one thing nor fully another. He had changed the empire more profoundly than almost any emperor before him. He had not saved it, but he had ensured that whatever it became next, it would carry the Christian faith forward with it, into the medieval kingdoms of Europe, into the Byzantine East, into the long, complex, still unfinished story of Western civilization. There is something quietly profound about the geography of what Constantine built. The old Rome, the city on the 7 hills, the city of the Forum and the Colosseum and the marble temples of the Capitoline remained, but the living center of power had moved. Constantinople, the new Rome on the Bosphorus, was younger, fresher, more defensible, and positioned at the crossing point of 2 continents. It faced east, toward the richest provinces, toward the most sophisticated urban culture, toward the deep wells of Greek philosophy and Eastern religious tradition that would nourish Byzantine civilization for 1,000 years. The old Rome was magnificent, the new Rome was alive, and the distance between them, not just in miles, but in orientation, in identity, in what they were each pointed toward, would prove in the long run impossible to bridge. Let the 2 cities rest side by side in your imagination as you drift. The old Rome on its 7 hills, its marble slightly faded now, its crowd still present but its authority slowly hollowing, and the new Constantinople gleaming on its peninsula between 2 seas, young and confident and reaching eastward into a future the old city could not quite see. Between them, the empire that had once been singular is beginning, quietly and without announcement, to become 2 things, 2 centers of gravity, 2 versions of what Rome meant, pulling gently in different directions. Why did Rome fall? Because it was also, in a very real sense, moving, transforming itself from the inside, asking new questions about what it was and what it was for. And the answer to those questions, worked out over the following centuries in theology and architecture and law and language and the slow drift of power, was not the end of Rome. It was the beginning of something else, something enormous, complicated, still present in the world tonight, in the churches and the legal codes and the languages and the very categories of thought we use to make sense of our lives. The new God is young tonight in Constantine's empire. The old temples are still standing. The question of what Rome is becoming moves through the streets of 2 cities at once, quiet as a river in the dark, patient as stone, unhurried as the long unfolding of history towards something none of its participants can yet name.
There is a particular kind of ending that does not announce itself, not a collapse, not a catastrophe, not a battle or a burning, just a slow administrative drift toward a reality that, once it is settled into place, becomes impossible to reverse. The division of the Roman Empire into eastern and western halves was that kind of ending. No single emperor decreed it permanent. No treaty was signed, no ceremony performed, no moment marked as the last day of a unified Rome. It happened the way fog happens, gradually, everywhere at once, until the landscape you thought you knew has become unrecognizable. Why did Rome fall? Part of the answer is simply this: it divided. And the 2 halves, once divided, had very different fates ahead of them. The practical roots of the division go back, as we have already visited, to Diocletian's tetrarchy, the recognition that an empire spanning 3 continents could not be governed from a single point. But the permanent separation came later, crystallizing in the reign of Theodosius I, the last emperor to rule the full extent of the Roman Empire as a unified state. When Theodosius died in 395 CE, he divided the empire between his 2 sons, Arcadius, 18 years old, taking the east, and Honorius, 10 years old, taking the west. It was meant to be a division of administration, not of identity. The empire was still, legally and conceptually, one thing, but the 2 young men who inherited it were not equal to what they had been given, and the worlds they inherited were not equal to each other.
The eastern half was, by every practical measure, the stronger half. It contained the wealthiest provinces, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and the most urbanized, most commercially active, most culturally sophisticated populations of the Roman world. Its capital, Constantinople, was brilliantly defended by its geography and its walls.
Its administrative class was experienced and deeply embedded in the traditions of Roman governance. It had more people, more revenue, more institutional depth. The western half had Rome. It had the prestige, the myth, the accumulated weight of 7 centuries of symbolic centrality. But prestige, by the late 4th century, had become increasingly difficult to convert into the practical currencies of survival: soldiers and grain and tax revenue and defensible borders.
The contrast between the two courts in the decades after Theodosius is almost painful to observe from the distance of history. In the East, a succession of emperors, some capable, some not, nonetheless presided over a functioning state, a productive economy, and a diplomatic tradition skilled enough to manage the barbarian pressures by redirection, subsidy, and the occasional well-placed marriage alliance. The East bought time, consistently, by being willing to spend money rather than soldiers. In the West, the court of Honorius moved from Milan to Ravenna in 402 CE, not for strategic reasons, but because Ravenna was surrounded by marshes and therefore hard to reach by barbarian armies. The emperor of the West had retreated to a swamp. The symbolism was not lost on contemporaries.
The Western court at Ravenna became, in the 5th century, a place of extraordinary unreality, an imperial administration maintaining all the forms and titles and ceremonial of a universal empire, while its actual control of territory shrank steadily, province by province, decade by decade. Emperors were proclaimed and deposed with dizzying frequency, most of them puppets of powerful military commanders, men like Stilicho, Aetius, Ricimer, who held the real power and used the imperial title as a legitimizing accessory rather than a governing authority. The Empire of the West was becoming, in practice, a theater, a performance of Roman governance staged for an audience that was itself disappearing.
Why did Rome fall? Here is an answer rooted in the division itself, because the two halves needed each other in ways neither fully acknowledged until the need could no longer be met. The West needed the East's wealth and administrative sophistication. The East needed the West's symbolic prestige and its geographic role as a buffer against the Germanic pressure from the North. Once divided, each half was diminished in ways that the formal unity had obscured. And the diminishment of the West in particular accelerated once it became clear that the East was unwilling, or perhaps simply unable, given its own pressures, to rescue it. There were moments when the division might have been reversed, when a strong emperor or a favorable military situation seemed to offer the possibility of reunification. Theodosius himself had briefly reunited the empire by force in 394 CE, defeating a Western usurper at the Battle of the Frigidus. But his death the following year scattered that reunification before it could take root. Justinian, ruling from Constantinople in the 6th century, would reconquer much of the Western Mediterranean, North Africa, Italy, part of Spain, in a military campaign of extraordinary ambition. But his reconquest did not last. The West he recaptured was not the West that had been lost. The world had moved on. The cities of the Western Empire in the 5th century tell the story more clearly than any political narrative. Trier, which had been an imperial capital under the Tetrarchy, a magnificent city of baths and basilicas and a palace complex that rivaled anything in Rome, was sacked 4 times between 407 and 428 CE. Londinium, Roman London, reached its peak population around 100 CE and then contracted steadily through the 3rd and 4th centuries as the economic logic that had made a large city viable in Britain quietly dissolved. Carthage, great, wealthy, ancient Carthage, the city Rome had destroyed and rebuilt and made the capital of its African grain supply, fell to the Vandals in 439 CE and was cut off from the Western Empire entirely. Each of these cities had been, in its heyday, a node in the network, a point where the roads and the trade and the administration converged into something that felt from the inside like the permanent furniture of the world. and then one by one they contracted, quieted, became smaller versions of themselves.
But here is the thing worth carrying quietly into sleep. The people did not disappear. The farmers kept farming. The craftsmen kept working. The bishops kept administering their dioceses, which in many cases had become the most functional governing institution in a landscape where the imperial administration had thinned to near invisibility. Latin kept being spoken. Roman law kept being applied, imperfectly and incompletely, in the courts of the Germanic kingdoms that were settling into the western provinces. The aqueducts that still worked kept carrying water. The roads that were still maintained kept carrying travelers. The division of the empire did not divide the civilization. It distributed it.
Let that thought move through you gently. The civilization distributed, not destroyed. Thinned and transformed and spread across a wider, more fragmented landscape, yes. Diminished in certain ways that matter enormously. But present, still present. In the Latin of the Church, and the memory of the law, and the shape of the roads, and the plan of the cities, and the idea carried forward in the minds of the Germanic kings who now ruled the western provinces, that they were the inheritors of something whose worth required no argument. Why did Rome fall? It divided, and the western half grew too thin to hold its own weight. But the eastern half endured for 1,000 more years, and the western half, transformed, diminished, distributed across a dozen new kingdoms, kept the fire going in ways that no one at the time could entirely see or measure. The two cities tonight are both lit. Constantinople gleams on its peninsula. Ravenna flickers in its marsh. Between them, across the dark water of the Adriatic, the empire that was once one thing is becoming many things, and the many things are each carrying a piece of what the one thing was. Sleep comes that way too, not all at once, but in pieces, the thoughts loosening one by one, the boundaries dissolving, the single waking self becoming something softer and more diffuse, distributed across the quiet dark. Let it come now. There is no hurry. The empire is dividing softly in the night and taking the whole long story forward with it.
Every story needs an ending, even when the thing the story is about does not actually end. History has a habit of selecting moments, particular days, particular events, particular numbers on a calendar, and designating them as the point after which everything was different. Sometimes these designations are arbitrary, sometimes they are profoundly misleading, and sometimes they are both arbitrary and misleading, and yet still carry a weight that nothing else quite captures, the weight of a symbol, which is a different kind of truth than the weight of a fact. September 4th, 476 CE is that kind of date, the day the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was deposed, the day history has chosen, with reasonable if imperfect justification, to call the fall of Rome. Why did Rome fall? On this date, at least, we can say, it fell like this.
His name was Romulus Augustulus. The diminutive Augustulus, Little Augustus, was not an official title, but a nickname, and it carried within it a quiet cruelty that history has amplified over the centuries. The last emperor of the West was named Romulus, after the city's mythic founder, and Augustus, after its greatest ruler, as if the empire, in its final hours, could not resist the irony of concentrating all its founding names into the person of the boy who would preside over its ending. He was perhaps 15 years old. He had been placed on the throne by his father, a general named Orestes, who held the actual power. He had reigned for 10 months.
The man who deposed him was Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain of mixed Skyrrian and Hunnic heritage who commanded the foederati troops that constituted most of what remained of the Western Roman army. He had led a mutiny when Orestes refused to grant his soldiers the land in Italy they had been promised. Orestes was killed. Romulus Augustulus was deposed, not executed, but sent into comfortable exile at a castle in Campania, where he was given a pension and left to live out his days in obscurity. Odoacer did not proclaim himself emperor. He sent the imperial insignia, the purple robes, the diadem, the symbols of Western Roman sovereignty, to Constantinople, with a message to the Eastern Emperor Zeno explaining that the West no longer required a separate emperor. One emperor ruling from Constantinople was sufficient for the whole.
Zeno, receiving the insignia of the Western Empire in Constantinople, was not entirely pleased. Odoacer was not his man, and the arrangement was not one he had designed. But he was also not in a position to reverse it militarily, and the diplomatic formula Odoacer offered, that the West acknowledged the Eastern Emperor's nominal sovereignty, allowed everyone to maintain a degree of faith. Zeno granted Odoacer the title of patrician. The Western Empire, at least formally, was not abolished. It was simply absorbed, returned to the East. The circle, in a certain legalistic sense, closed. Nobody at the time seems to have understood that something epochal had occurred. The Eastern court in Constantinople noted the event with what appears from the surviving documents to be relatively limited alarm. The bishops in the western provinces continued their correspondence. The Germanic kings, who now ruled Gaul and Spain and North Africa, continued to use Roman administrative forms. Life, in most of the places that had constituted the Western Empire, continued with what looks from the outside like remarkable continuity. And yet something had ended. Not the civilization, we have established that and will return to it, but something real and specific and irreplaceable had ended. The Western Roman state, the unbroken institutional continuity from the founding of the Republic in 509 BCE, through the wars against Carthage and the conquests of the East, through the civil wars and the Augustan settlement and the Pax Romana and the crisis of the 3rd century and Diocletian's reforms and Constantine's conversion and the slow unraveling of the 4th and 5th centuries. That specific, continuous, identifiable thing was gone. 982 years from the traditional founding of the Republic to the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, nearly a millennium of continuous institutional existence. Whatever we say about transformation and continuity, that is a specific thing that ended on a specific day, and it is worth acknowledging its ending, quietly, before we move on to what came next.
Why did Rome fall? Here, at the conventional answer to the question, the honest response is, for all the reasons we have been tracing together through these long, slow chapters: the overextension, the fiscal strain, the currency debasement, the plague, the climate shift, the succession crises, the militarization of politics, the division, the loss of civic belief in the system, the borders that could not hold, the cost of the legions, the impossible job of governing something too large for any available system to govern. All of it, together, over centuries, accumulating with the patient logic of compound interest, until the structure that had been built on those foundations could no longer bear the weight. No single cause, no single moment, a long, slow, multi-generational process that ended, arbitrarily but not inappropriately, with a 15-year-old boy handing back a purple robe. There is something worth sitting with in the figure of Romulus Augustulus himself, not as a symbol of failure or decline, but simply as a human being caught in the machinery of history at a moment he had no power to affect. He did not choose to be emperor. He did not choose to be deposed. He was a boy, placed on a throne by his father, removed by a general,
sent to a seaside castle to tend its gardens and grow old in the sound of the Mediterranean surf. The castle was called Castellum Lucullanum, the former villa of the great Republican general Lucullus, one of the men who had helped build the empire that his distant successor was now quietly asked to vacate. There is a full circle in that geography if you are inclined to look for it. The empire that began with ambition ended in a garden by the sea.
The western provinces in the decades following 476 CE did not look dramatically different from the western provinces in the decades before. The Ostrogothic kingdom that Theodoric established in Italy, with Constantinople's eventual blessing, maintained Roman law, Roman administrative titles, Roman coinage, Roman senatorial culture. Theodoric himself was a man who had spent his formative years as a hostage in Constantinople, deeply formed by Roman culture, genuinely committed to the preservation of what Rome had built. His court employed the philosopher Boethius and the scholar Cassiodorus. His buildings were Roman. His ambitions were Roman. He simply was not, technically, Roman. The difference was real, but it was subtle, and subtle differences, over generations, compound into transformations.
Boethius is perhaps worth a moment's attention here in the quiet dark. He was a Roman senator, a philosopher, a translator of Greek thought into Latin, the man through whom much of Aristotle reached the medieval West. He served in Theodoric's administration and was eventually accused of treason, imprisoned, and executed in 524 CE. In prison, awaiting death, he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, a meditation on fortune, fate, and the nature of true happiness, framed as a dialogue with the personified figure of philosophy herself. It is one of the most widely read books of the entire medieval period, translated into English by King Alfred, by Chaucer, by Queen Elizabeth I. It was written by a Roman, in Latin, in an Ostrogothic prison, in the last generation of people who could still call themselves, without any historical qualification, citizens of Rome. And it is, in its way, a perfect emblem of what the fall of Rome actually meant. Not an ending of thought or beauty or the desire to understand, but a transformation of the vessel that carried those things forward.
Let Romulus Augustulus rest now in his garden by the sea. Let Boethius write in his prison cell. Let Odoacer rule in Ravenna with Roman titles and Germanic soldiers. Let Theodoric build his palace and his mausoleum and his churches and his kingdom that is and is not Rome. Let Constantinople continue, untroubled, on its peninsula, the Eastern Empire carrying the name and the law and the faith forward into centuries that the Western provinces will reach by a different road. Why did Rome fall? It fell the way all large things fall, slowly, incompletely, leaving more behind than the word falling suggests. It fell into the ground of the Middle Ages the way a great tree falls into a forest, feeding as it decomposes the roots of everything growing around it, giving itself, piece by piece, to what came next. The date is September 4th, 476. The boy is in his garden. The sea is very still. And Rome, the idea of Rome, the memory of Rome, the grammar and the law and the faith and the roads and the categories of thought, is already, quietly, everywhere.
There is a word we have been using throughout this long, slow night, barbarian, and it is time, here in the quieter hours, to sit with it honestly for a moment. The word comes from the Greek barbaros, meaning, roughly, one who speaks unintelligibly, one whose language sounds to Greek ears like the repetitive syllable bar, 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 noise rather than speech. It was a word of exclusion, of condescension, of the deep human habit of defining the self by naming the other. The Romans inherited it from the Greeks
and applied it with the same casual certainty to everyone beyond their borders. But the people who crossed those borders and settled in the western provinces were not noise. They were not chaos in human form. They were peoples with their own histories, their own laws, their own poetry, their own profound and genuine cultures. And what they did with what they inherited from Rome is one of the most interesting stories in the whole of Western history. Why did Rome fall? Perhaps in part because the word barbarian was never as accurate as the Romans believed.
The Germanic kingdoms that emerged in the western provinces in the 5th and 6th centuries were not, with a few partial exceptions, interested in destroying what Rome had built. They were interested in possessing it, in ruling it, in benefiting from it, in wrapping their own authority in its prestige. The Visigoths in Spain issued law codes modeled directly on Roman law. The Franks in Gaul maintained Roman administrative structures, used Roman titles, corresponded in Latin, and sought legitimacy from the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. The Ostrogoths in Italy, as we have already seen, were so thoroughly Romanized in their governing practices that many ordinary Romans barely noticed the change at the top. What they inherited was not ruins, it was a functioning, if diminished, civilization, and they ran it. The law is perhaps the clearest example of this inheritance. Roman law, the accumulated legal wisdom of nearly a millennium, codified and refined through centuries of judicial practice, did not vanish with the Western Empire. It was absorbed into the legal systems of the successor kingdoms, preserved in compilations and codes, applied in courts, taught in the schools that continued to function in Italy and Gaul and Spain under Germanic rule. The Visigothic Code, the Burgundian Code, the law codes of the Franks, all of them Roman in their structure, their terminology, their underlying assumptions about what law was for and how it should operate. Roman law would survive not just in the Germanic successor kingdoms, but in the Catholic Church's canon law, in the Byzantine legal tradition, and ultimately in the great medieval revival of Roman jurisprudence that produced the legal foundations of modern Europe. The law outlasted the empire that made it by more than 1,000 years. It is, in certain respects, still alive today. The Latin language is another thread of inheritance so deep it is almost invisible. The Germanic kings and their peoples spoke their own languages among themselves, Gothic, Frankish, Burgundian, but they administered, corresponded, legislated, and prayed in Latin. The Catholic Church, whose organizational reach extended into every corner of the former Western Empire, was a Latin institution. Its liturgy, its theology, its correspondence, its records all conducted in the language of Rome. And from that Latin, slowly, over the centuries following the fall, the Romance languages of modern Europe were born. French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, all of them daughters of Latin, all of them carrying in their grammar and their vocabulary and the deep structure of their sentences the daily speech of people who lived and died in the Roman world 1,500 years ago. Every time a speaker of French says bonjour, or a speaker of Spanish says ciudad, they are, in a very literal linguistic sense, still speaking Rome.
The road network endured longer than almost anything else. Roman roads, built with a thoroughness and a geological understanding of drainage and foundation that modern engineers still admire, proved extraordinarily durable. Many of them remained the primary routes of travel and commerce through the entire medieval period, not because anyone was maintaining them to Roman standards, but because the original construction was so sound that centuries of use and neglect still left them more functional than anything that replaced them. The roads outlasted the army that built them. They outlasted the empire that needed them. They became, quietly, the skeleton of medieval Europe.
Why did Rome fall?
Here, standing in the middle of what the barbarians inherited, is an answer that reframes the question entirely. Perhaps Rome did not fall so much as it was redistributed. The things that had made Rome Rome, the law, the language, the roads, the administrative structures, the concept of a universal civilizing mission, the faith that had become its official religion, were not lost. They were carried forward by the very peoples that the traditional narrative of the fall casts as Rome's destroyers. The barbarians did not kill Rome, they became Rome. Imperfectly, partially, in versions that Rome itself would not always have recognized, but recognizably, continuously, with a fidelity to the inheritance that is one of the most underappreciated facts of early medieval history.
Theodoric the Great is perhaps the clearest embodiment of this paradox. He ruled Italy from 493 to 526 CE, 33 years of governance that most Italians, by most accounts, experienced as a period of genuine peace and prosperity. He repaired the aqueducts, he maintained the grain supply, he preserved the Senate. He sponsored the philosopher Boethius and the scholar Cassiodorus, who spent much of his career explicitly dedicated to the project of preserving Roman learning for the future. Theodoric's court was, in its cultural ambitions, more consciously Roman than many of the late Western emperors had been. He was also an Ostrogoth, an Arian Christian whom the Catholic Church regarded with theological suspicion, a man who had grown up a hostage in Constantinople and ruled in Ravenna with an army of Germanic warriors. He was Rome's inheritor and Rome's other, simultaneously, without apparent contradiction.
The monasteries deserve their own quiet moment here. In the century after the fall of the Western Empire, as the political landscape of Europe fragmented into competing kingdoms and the infrastructure of the Pax Romana continued its slow unraveling, it was the monasteries that became the primary custodians of Roman learning. Monks copying manuscripts in cold scriptoria, their breath visible in winter air, their fingers cramped around quill pens, preserved Virgil and Cicero and Ovid and the church fathers and the legal texts and the agricultural manuals and the medical treatises of the ancient world. They did not always understand what they were copying. Sometimes they copied over texts they found less useful with texts they found more urgent. Palimpsests, the scholars call them, manuscripts scraped and reused, the old writing still faintly visible beneath the new. But they copied, and in copying, they kept the thread from breaking. The Library of Rome, distributed across 1,000 cold rooms in 100 monasteries, survived the fall that the empire did not.
Lie quietly and imagine a monk in the 6th century in a monastery somewhere in Ireland or Northumbria or the Italian countryside, bent over a manuscript by lamplight. He is copying a text written 500 years before his birth in a city he has never seen by a man whose world he cannot fully imagine. He does not know that he is preserving civilization. He thinks he is doing his duty, his small assigned portion of the great work of prayer and study that constitutes the monastic life. But his careful hand, moving across the parchment in the firelight, is carrying Rome forward across the darkness of the centuries. That is what inheritance looks like, most of the time. Not dramatic, not conscious of its own importance, just careful hands doing the next necessary thing. Why did Rome fall? Because it was time for it to become something else. Because the specific form it had taken, the centralized imperial state, the universal military presence, the administrative apparatus spanning 3 continents, had exhausted the conditions that made it possible and could not regenerate them. But the things that had made Rome worth preserving, worth inheriting, worth carrying forward across the darkness, those things did not require the empire to survive. They required only that someone care enough to keep them, and someone always did. The barbarians inherited Rome the way children inherit their parents, imperfectly, selectively, carrying forward the things they understood and valued, setting aside the things they didn't, and becoming in the process something genuinely new that is nonetheless unmistakably continuous with what came before. The lamps are burning in the monasteries tonight. The roads are still there, under the medieval mud. The law is still being argued in the courts of Germanic kings, and Latin, the great carrier of everything, is still on every tongue that matters, still alive, still working, still holding the inheritance together, in the only way inheritance ever truly holds. One word at a time, one copied page at a time, one careful human hand at a time, moving through the dark.
While the western half of the empire was fragmenting into Germanic kingdoms, while Romulus Augustulus was tending his garden by the sea, while monks were copying manuscripts in cold scriptoria, and Frankish kings were issuing laws in imperfect Latin, while all of that was happening in the West, something else was happening in the East, something that the traditional story of Rome's fall tends to treat as a footnote, or an epilogue, or a separate story entirely. But it was not separate. It was Rome, continuous, unbroken, self-consciously Roman in every title and ceremony and legal formula, still functioning, still governing, still defending its borders and debating its theology and building its churches and training its armies. Why did Rome fall? In the East, by the reckoning of the people living there, it had not fallen at all.
The civilization we call Byzantine, named by later historians after Byzantium, the Greek colony on whose site Constantine had built his capital, did not call itself Byzantine. It called itself Rome. Its emperors held the title of Roman Emperor. Its legal system was Roman law. Its official language for the first several centuries was Latin. Its people called themselves Romaioi, Romans. The word Byzantine was invented by Western scholars in the 16th century, centuries after the civilization it described had ended, as a way of distinguishing the medieval Eastern Empire from the classical Western one. The Byzantines themselves would have found the distinction puzzling, or perhaps offensive. They were Rome. They had always been Rome. The West had fallen. They had not.
Constantinople in the 5th and 6th centuries was the largest, wealthiest, most sophisticated city in the Western world. At a time when Rome itself had contracted to perhaps 20 or 30,000 people, a fraction of its imperial peak, Constantinople held perhaps 500,000. Its markets traded goods from China and India and sub-Saharan Africa. Its university preserved the traditions of Greek philosophy and Roman law. Its churches were the most magnificent buildings in the world. Its hippodrome, the great chariot racing stadium adjacent to the imperial palace, held 100,000 spectators and served as the social and political heart of the city. Walking through Constantinople in the year 500 CE, you would have had no sense whatsoever that Rome had fallen. You would have had every sense that you were at the center of the world.
Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE, was the emperor who came closest to reuniting the divided empire, and whose reign most clearly illustrates both the extraordinary capacity and the fundamental limitations of what Byzantium was. He reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and a portion of Spain from the Visigoths. He commissioned the construction of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Liztome in Constantinople, whose dome, when completed in 537 CE, was the largest in the world and would remain so for nearly 1,000 years. He codified Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, the most comprehensive legal compilation in history, whose influence on modern legal systems is direct and enormous. He also exhausted the empire's resources, depopulated Italy through 20 years of devastating reconquest warfare, and left his successors a state too large and too strained to hold what he had won.
The Hagia Sophia deserves its own quiet moment here in the dark. Imagine standing inside it in the year 560 CE, the dome above you 180 feet high, its base pierced by 40 windows so that it appears, in the words of the historian Procopius, to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The light pours in from every direction, reflecting off gold mosaics, catching the marble columns and the colored stone of the floors. The building is so large, so luminous, so suffused with the sense of something transcendent made physical, that the medieval Russian envoys who visited it reported back to their prince that they could not tell whether they were in heaven or on earth. That building, still standing in Istanbul today, still overwhelming 15 centuries after its construction, is Rome. Not the Rome of the legions and the Forum and the Republic, but Rome as it had become, Christian, Eastern, golden, reaching upward.
Why did Rome fall? Here is the answer the Byzantines themselves would have given, from their own perspective across 1,000 years of continued existence. It didn't. The western provinces were lost, yes, a painful amputation, a diminishment, a tragedy. But the empire continued. The emperor reigned in Constantinople. The law was administered. The faith was kept. The borders were defended, generation after generation, against Persians and Arabs and Bulgars and Normans and Crusaders. Rome fell, in the Byzantine understanding, not in 476 CE, but on May 29, 1453, the day Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople, and the last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died fighting in the streets. That is not 476. That is nearly 1,000 years later. Rome, in the East, lasted nearly 1,000 years after its supposed fall.
Those 1,000 years were not a static period of simple preservation. Byzantine civilization evolved, innovated, transformed. Its official language shifted from Latin to Greek over the course of the 6th and 7th centuries. Its theology produced controversies, the iconoclasm debates, the Monophysite controversy, the final split with the Western Church in 1054, that shaped the religious map of the world we still inhabit. Its art developed a visual language of such distinctive power and beauty that it influenced everything from Russian Orthodox iconography to the mosaics of medieval Sicily. It also suffered. The Arab conquests of the 7th century stripped it of its wealthiest provinces, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, reducing it from a Mediterranean empire to a regional power centered on Asia Minor and the Balkans. The Fourth Crusade of 1204, launched by Western Christians who were nominally Byzantium's co-religionists, sacked Constantinople and ruled it for 50 years. The empire recovered, but never fully. The walls that had held for 1,000 years were never quite the same afterward. There is something quietly moving about the last centuries of Byzantine history, the empire contracting slowly around its capital, losing province after province to the advancing Ottoman Turks, until by the early 15th century, the Empire of Rome consisted essentially of Constantinople and a few outlying territories. The Emperor John VIII Palaiologos traveled to Italy in 1438 in a last desperate attempt to secure Western military aid by negotiating the reunion of the Eastern and Western churches, a theological compromise that his own clergy and people largely rejected, and that produced no meaningful military support from the West. He returned to Constantinople and waited. His brother Constantine XI succeeded him and waited. The walls held a little longer, and then, in 1453, they did not.
The fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent a wave of scholars and manuscripts westward. Greek-speaking intellectuals carrying the accumulated learning of Byzantium into Italy, where it fell on soil already prepared by the early Renaissance. The texts they brought, Greek philosophical and scientific works, many unknown in the West for centuries, poured fuel onto the intellectual fire that was already burning. The Renaissance, that great flowering of art and thought and the recovery of classical antiquity, was fed, in no small part, by the fall of the Second Rome. Even in its ending, Byzantine civilization was generative. Even in its destruction, it was teaching. The library of the East joined the library of the West, and from their union came something new that carried both forward. Let the long arc of it settle over you now, as you drift. Rome in the East, lasting nearly 15 centuries from its founding, 1,000 years after the Western Empire's conventional end date, finally closing on a May morning in 1453, when the last emperor died with his boots on in the streets of a city his civilization had held since 330 CE. That is not a story of failure. That is one of the longest stories of institutional continuity in human history. That is a civilization that looked into the abyss repeatedly across 11 centuries and found reasons to continue. Why did Rome fall? In the East, it fell last of all, not in the 5th century, but in the 15th, not to Germanic warriors, but to Ottoman cannons, not quietly, but fighting. The last emperor refusing evacuation, choosing to die in the walls of the city his predecessors had built. There is a dignity in that ending that the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, for all its historical significance, does not quite match. The Hagia Sophia stands tonight in Istanbul, its domes still visible across the Bosphorus, its mosaics still breathing under their later coverings, its 40 windows still carrying light downward into the space where Rome, in its most transformed and most enduring version, once gathered to pray. The building is still there. The light still falls the same way. Rome, in stone and in light, is still standing.
There is a test you can perform, silently, right now, in the dark. Think of a word, any word from the language you are listening to tonight. A simple word. Civil, legal, Senate, republic, military, province, calendar, forum, aquifer, census, juvenile, pedestrian, mundane. Each of these words was Latin. Each of them entered the English language through the long chain of inheritance that runs from Rome, through the Catholic Church, through Norman French, through the English of lawyers and scholars, and eventually into the mouths of everyone. They are so ordinary now, so fully absorbed, that their origin is invisible. And yet they are there, small, quiet, daily proofs that Rome never entirely left. Why did Rome fall? Here is a gentle answer. It didn't fall out of the language, and language is where civilization lives longest. Latin did not die when the Western Empire fell. It could not die because it was the language of the one institution that outlasted the empire and maintained its organizational coherence through every subsequent century of political fragmentation, the Catholic Church. The Church had been born in the Roman world, had grown up speaking its language, had developed its theology in Latin, had organized its councils and written its correspondence and conducted its liturgy in Latin. When the empire's administrative structures dissolved, the Church's administrative structures remained, and they remained Latin. For well over 1,000 years after 476 CE, Latin was the language of educated Europe. Every scholar, every lawyer, every physician, every theologian, every diplomat wrote and argued and debated in the language of Cicero and Caesar and Virgil.
A scholar in medieval England could correspond with a scholar in Poland or Spain or Italy without a translator, because all of them thought in the same language. Latin was the internet of the medieval world, the shared protocol that allowed information to flow across political and linguistic boundaries.
The Roman calendar is so deeply embedded in the way we organize time that most people never notice it at all. The 7-day week, the 12 months, the names of those months: January from Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings; March from Mars, the god of war; June from Juno, the queen of the gods; July from Julius Caesar; August from Augustus. The days of the week mapped onto the Roman planetary system: Saturn from Saturn, Sunday from Sol, Monday from Luna. We mark time every day in the language of a civilization that collapsed 15 centuries ago. The calendar is Rome's most intimate surviving presence, more intimate than any monument or legal code, because it is inside the daily rhythm of every life in the Western world.
The legal inheritance is perhaps even more consequential than the linguistic one, though less immediately visible. Roman law, the corpus juris civilis of Justinian, preserved in Byzantium, rediscovered in the West in the 11th and 12th centuries, taught in the new universities of Bologna and Paris and Oxford, became the foundation of European legal thought. The distinction between public and private law, the concept of legal personhood, the presumption of innocence, the idea that law should be written, consistent, and publicly known, the rights of contract and property, the procedures of evidence and testimony. All of these concepts, so fundamental to modern legal systems that they feel like natural law rather than historical inheritance, trace their lineage to Roman jurisprudence. Every courtroom in the Western world is, in some measurable sense, a Roman room.
The physical inheritance is less complete, but still extraordinary. The roads we have already traced, their routes followed by highways, their stones occasionally still visible. The aqueduct principle, gravity-fed water delivery through engineered channels, still operates in modified form in municipal water systems. The arch, the vault, the dome, architectural techniques developed and refined by Roman engineers, became the structural vocabulary of medieval European architecture, and through it, of the entire Western building tradition. Every cathedral in Europe is, in its structural logic, a Roman building. The city plans are perhaps the most striking physical inheritance of all. The grid plan that Rome imposed on its colonial cities, the Cardo and Decumanus, the main north-south and east-west axes, with the Forum at their intersection, is still legible in the street plans of dozens of European cities. The center of modern London follows the outline of Roman Londinium. The center of modern Cologne follows the outline of Roman Colonia. Walk through the old quarters of these cities today, and you are, quite literally, walking in Roman footsteps.
Why did Rome fall? Here, in the middle of all this inheritance, is perhaps the most interesting answer of the entire 2 hours. The question itself is Roman. The habit of asking large questions about the rise and fall of civilizations, of seeking historical patterns, of believing that the past can be understood and that understanding it is worth the effort. That intellectual tradition is Roman, inherited from the Greeks whom Rome absorbed and transmitted. Edward Gibbon, writing his great history of Rome's decline in the 18th century, was doing something Rome had taught him to do. The question contains its own answer. The political vocabulary of the modern world is Roman to a degree that is almost embarrassing once you begin to notice it. Republic, from res publica, the public thing. Senate, from senex, old man, the council of elders. Constitution, from constitutio, the act of establishing. Citizen, from civis, a member of the civic community. Democracy is Greek, but the institutions it describes in the modern world, the representative assemblies, the separation of powers, the written constitution, the independent judiciary, were all significantly shaped by the Roman Republican tradition, as filtered through the Renaissance recovery of classical political thought and the Enlightenment thinkers who built modern democratic theory on classical foundations. The American founders read Cicero. They named their legislature after the Roman Senate. They built their capital city in a neoclassical architectural style that declared in every column and dome and portico their conscious identification with the Roman Republican tradition. Washington, D.C. is, in its self-presentation, Rome.
And then there is the faith, perhaps the deepest and most pervasive of all the Roman inheritances. Christianity was born in a Roman province, was shaped by Roman roads and Roman peace and Roman administrative structures, was argued over in councils convened by Roman emperors, was organized into dioceses that mapped onto Roman provincial boundaries, was carried to the furthest corners of the Roman world by missionaries traveling Roman roads. The Catholic Church adopted Latin as its language, Roman administrative structures as its organizational model, and the concept of universal jurisdiction, the idea that one authority could govern the whole of Christendom directly from the Roman imperial tradition. The Pope's full title includes Pontifex Maximus, the supreme bridge builder, a title originally held by the chief priest of the Roman state religion, later adopted by the emperors, and eventually transferred to the Bishop of Rome. The successor of Peter sits in the successor of Augustus's city, bearing the title of Augustus's priests, governing an institution whose organizational DNA is Roman from its foundations.
Lie quietly for a moment and feel the full weight of what we have been tracing tonight, not just through this chapter, but through all the chapters that have brought us here. The question we began with, why did Rome fall, has led us through 700 years of Republican history, through the Pax Romana and the century of crisis and the plagues and the climate shifts and the impossible job of governing a continent and the border that would not hold, and Constantine's conversion and the division and the last emperor in his garden, and the barbarians who became Romans, and Byzantium standing for 1,000 more years. And now here, in the language and the law and the calendar and the roads and the churches and the political vocabulary of the modern world. Why did Rome fall? Because it became everything, because it dissolved into the foundations of the world that followed it so completely that distinguishing between Rome and not Rome became, after a certain point, almost impossible. It fell the way salt falls into water, not lost, but transformed, present everywhere, invisible, essential.
The next time you use the word civil, or sign a legal document, or look at the calendar on your wall, or walk down a street that follows a grid laid out 2,000 years ago, or sit in a court of law and hear the presumption of innocence invoked, or enter a church whose nave follows the plan of a Roman basilica, or hear Latin words in the liturgy, or look at the dome of a public building, or read a political document that speaks of republic and constitution and citizen. Remember that you are not looking at history. You are standing inside it. You are living inside Rome's longest project, the one it undertook not deliberately, but inevitably, the one that required its fall to complete. Rome did not fall away from us, it fell into us, and we have been carrying it ever since, in our words and our laws and our buildings and our faith, and the way we measure the days of our lives, without knowing it, without needing to know it, the way you carry the deep grammar of your first language without ever thinking about its rules. The words are Rome's, the night is old, and somewhere in the structure of everything you will think tomorrow, every sentence, every legal right, every hour marked on a Roman clock, Rome is still speaking, soft and patient, and completely unhurried, the way it has been speaking since the beginning of everything we call the Western world. We are nearly at the end now. Not of the story. The story, as we have been tracing it, has no end, only transformations, only the long, continuous thread of inheritance running forward through centuries and languages and faiths and legal codes into the present moment, into this room, into the breath you are drawing right now. But we are nearly at the end of the telling, and before we arrive at the final quietness, it is worth pausing here, in this second-to-last chapter, in the late hours, with sleep very close, to let the central question return one more time, not to answer it finally, but to feel how differently it sounds now than it did at the beginning. Why did Rome fall? You have heard many answers tonight. You have heard about overextension and fiscal strain and currency debasement and plague and climate change and succession crises and military overreach and political fragmentation, and the slow erosion of civic belief. You have heard about the borders that could not hold, and the legions that cost too much, and the emperors who faced an impossible job, and the division that weakened both halves, and the conversion that changed what the empire was for. Every one of those answers is true. Every one of them is partial, and none of them, held alone, is sufficient. The honest answer is that Rome fell for all of those reasons simultaneously, across centuries, in ways that interacted and compounded and reinforced each other, until the accumulated weight of them became more than the accumulated resilience of the system could absorb.
You are
It was
still
not
here.
one thing.
That
It was
is the
everything
first thing worth
together
noticing.
over a very
That
long
after
time.
2 hours and 15 centuries,
But there is
and
another
50
layer to the
million
question
people,
that we have not
and
yet
a dozen
named
languages,
directly.
and the
A layer
rise
that
and
becomes
fall
visible
and
only when you
transformation
step back
of the
far enough
greatest
to see the whole
civilization the
arc
Western
of what we
world
have
has
been
ever
tracing.
produced.
Rome
You are
is
still
not the
here,
only civilization that
still
has faced
breathing,
this question.
still
It
present,
is simply the one
at
that
least
faced
partially,
it first and
in the
largest,
soft borderland
and with enough
between
written
waking
record
and
that we can
sleep,
follow the
where the
process in
thoughts have
unusual
become loose,
detail.
and the body
Every
has grown heavy,
civilization of sufficient
and the
size and
distance
duration
between
has
you and the
eventually
pillow beneath
encountered
you
some version
has
of the
quietly
same pressures.
disappeared.
The overextension,
That
the
is
fiscal
where we
strain,
are now,
the demographic
right
stress,
at the edge.
the military cost,
And this last
the erosion
chapter
of shared
is
civic
not really
belief,
a chapter
the loss
at all.
of the conditions
It
that
is
made
a
the
settling,
original rise
a
possible.
slow, final
The Han
exhale
Dynasty in China,
of everything
roughly
we have
contemporary
carried together
with the Roman
through
Empire
the night.
and roughly similar in size and complexity,
Why
collapsed
did
in
Rome
220
fall?
CE under pressures that bear
question
remarkable
come
structural
one last
resemblance to
time.
Rome's.
Not as a
The
demand,
Gupta Empire in
not
India,
as something
the
requiring
Abbasid
an
Caliphate,
answer,
the
but
Song
simply
Dynasty,
as a sound,
the Ottoman Empire,
a familiar
the Mughal
sound
Empire.
by now.
Each of them,
The
in their
sound of a
own time
question
and
you have been
geography,
living
asked the
inside
same
for
question
2
Rome was
hours,
asking,
the way
and
you
each
live
of them
inside a piece of
eventually
music
received
that
the
has been
same
playing
answer.
long enough that you have stopped listening
This is
to
not
it
a counsel
and
of
started
despair.
simply being
It is
held
something more
by it.
interesting than despair.
The question
It
is not
pattern
urgent
recognition.
anymore. It
The
never
recognition
really
that
was.
the forces
It
which
was
challenge
always at its
large,
deepest
complex,
an
interconnected
invitation.
civilizations
An
are not
invitation to
random or
think
arbitrary,
slowly
but
about
structural,
large things,
that they
to
emerge
follow the
with something
thread of
approaching
human
inevitability
history through its
from the
long
very
and
conditions that
complicated
make large
and
civilizations
surprisingly
possible.
continuous journey
The specialization
from a
of
cluster
labor,
of huts
the
on 7
concentration of
hills
population,
to the world
the
you will
development
wake
of trade
into tomorrow
networks,
morning.
the accumulation of wealth in fewer hands,
Rome
the
is not
increasing
a place
complexity
you
of
have
governance,
to go to
the
to
gap
find.
between the pace at
You
which
do not
problems
have to
develop
book a flight
and the
to
pace at
Italy
which
or
institutions
stand
can
in the
respond.
forum in the afternoon
These are
heat,
not
or
flaws in any
press your
particular
hand against the
civilization.
stones of
They are the
Hadrian's
inherent
Wall in the
tensions of
Northumberland
civilization
wind.
itself,
Though
the
all of
price
those
of
things are
complexity,
worth doing
the
if you
shadow
ever
that
have the
follows
chance.
every achievement of scale.
Rome is already where you are.
Edward
Day
Gibbons, who
was when you
spent
lay
most
down
of his
tonight.
adult life thinking
It is in
about
the
this
shape
question,
of the buildings
concluded
and
his
the
great
plan of the
history
streets
with a reflection
and the
on
faith,
what the fall of
whatever
Rome
form it
meant
takes,
for the
that the
possibility of
civilization
civilizational
around you
collapse in
inherited
his own
from the
time,
long,
the late
imperfect,
18th century,
luminous Roman
the Age of
experiment.
Enlightenment, the
You
age
are
that was,
sleeping
without
inside
quite knowing
Rome
it,
tonight.
building the foundations of
always
the
have
modern
been.
industrial world. He concluded,
Think for a
cautiously,
moment.
that
gently,
the circumstances
without
that
effort,
had allowed the
just
Roman
letting
Empire
the
to
thought
fall were
arrive on its
unlikely to
own.
recur,
Of
that
all
the
the people
interconnectedness
who
of
have
the modern
fallen
world,
asleep in
the diffusion
Rome's
of
long
knowledge,
shadow
the
before
development
you,
of science and
the
technology
Roman farmer in
provided
his
buffers
villa
that
in the
Rome had
Italian
lacked.
countryside,
He was writing in
listening to the same
1776.
crickets that are
The French
still
Revolution
singing
was 13
somewhere
years
in
away.
Italy tonight.
The Industrial
The
Revolution was
Byzantine
beginning in
monk
the
in
English
his
Midlands
cell in
outside his window.
Constantinople,
The
his
full weight
lamp
of the
guttered,
modern age,
his
with all its
manuscripts set
extraordinary
aside,
achievements
sleep
and all its
arriving the
extraordinary new
same
forms
way
of the
it is
old
arriving
pressures,
for
was
you
just
now.
arriving. Gibbon
The
was right
medieval
that Rome's
scholar in his
specific
college in
circumstances
Oxford,
would not recur.
Latin
He
still
could not have
running
known
through
how
his mind
thoroughly
like
the new
water
age would
as
find
he
its own
drifted
versions
off.
of them.
The Renaissance merchant in his
Why did
palazzo,
Rome
the
fall?
classical world
Here,
reopening
in the
around
late
him
hours
like a
of this
flower,
long night,
falling
is
asleep
perhaps
in a
the
room
deepest
decorated
answer,
with motifs
the one that
borrowed
has been
from the
accumulating
very
quietly
civilization we
beneath
have
all
been
the
following
others.
all night.
Rome fell
All
because
of
it
them
was made of
asleep
time.
in Rome,
Because everything
just
made of time
like
changes, and everything that changes
There is a
eventually
word in
changes
Latin,
into something
quies,
unrecognizable
that
as its
means
former
rest
self.
or quiet,
Because the
or the
specific
particular
configuration
stillness
of
that
conditions
arrives
that
after
made
great
Rome
effort
possible
or
was
great
not
noise.
permanent.
The
Could not be
Romans used
permanent.
it for sleep,
And when those
for the
conditions
quiet
shifted,
of the
as all
countryside after the
conditions
heat
shift,
of the day,
given enough time,
for the peace
the
that follows
configuration
the
could not
resolution of a
hold.
long conflict.
This is not
Quies,
tragedy. It is
quiet.
physics. It
The
is the
two
nature
words
of
are the same
complex
word,
systems in a changing
separated
world.
by 15
And it
centuries
applies
of
not
slow
only to
transformation.
Rome, but to
The
everything
Latin
that has
slipping
ever
through
tried to
Old
hold a
French
shape
into English
against the current
and
of
arriving
time.
here tonight in this
What
moment,
makes Rome
in the breath
extraordinary
you are
is
drawing
not that
right
it fell.
now.
Everything
Quiet,
falls, eventually.
quies,
What makes Rome
Rome,
extraordinary
speaking
is how
softly
long
in the
it
dark.
held, how much it built while
You
holding,
do not have to
how
hold
deeply
any
it
of
embedded
it.
itself in the
That is
substrate
the
of
thing
everything
about a
that
story
followed,
told for
and how
sleep.
completely
It
it
is
managed
not
to
meant to
fall
be
into
remembered.
its successors,
It is not
rather
a
than
lecture,
simply away
not
from them.
an examination.
The Roman
not a
achievement was
set of
not
facts
permanence.
to be retained
It was
and
transformation.
reproduced.
The
It is a
capacity
journey,
to change,
and
to
journeys
absorb,
do not
to
require
incorporate,
souvenirs.
to become something
Whatever
new,
you have
while
taken in
remaining
tonight, the
recognizably
7
continuous
hills,
with what
the
it had been.
Republic's bargain, the Pax
That
Romana's
capacity,
roads,
the capacity
plague
for
years,
generative
the century of
transformation
crisis,
rather than
the
simple
last
collapse,
emperor in his
is
garden,
perhaps the
the
rarest
monks
and
in
most
their cold
valuable
rooms,
thing any
the Hagia
civilization
Sophia's
can
dome,
possess.
the Latin
Rome
words
had
dissolving
it,
into the
imperfectly
languages of
and
Europe.
inconsistently,
All of
but
it
it had
can
it.
go now.
And because
It
it
has
had
already
it,
done
we are
its
still
work
here
simply by
tonight
passing
in a
through you.
world shaped
You
by its
do not
presence,
need to keep it.
asking the question
Let it
it
settle
first
where it
taught
will,
us to ask.
in the deep places where the things we hear
There is a
before sleep
particular
go,
kind of comfort
somewhere
in the
below
long
memory
view,
and above
the
dream,
view from high
in the
enough
quiet
above the
archaeology
present moment
of a resting
that the
mind.
individual crises and collapses
The question
and
that
transformations
opened this
resolve
long
into
night
a larger
was,
pattern
why
of
did Rome
continuity.
fall? And you
Not
know now,
progress,
somewhere
necessarily.
below the level
The
of
long view
needing
does
to
not
articulate
promise
it,
progress,
that the question
but
was never
continuity.
quite the right
The
question.
sense that human
The right
beings
question was
across
something
all the
more like,
centuries and
what
all the
was
catastrophes
Rome,
and
really?
all the losses
And the answer,
have kept
worked
going,
out across
have kept
15
building
centuries
and
in
thinking
2 hours,
writing
and the
arguing
entire
and
complicated,
falling and
luminous,
rising
heartbreaking,
and carrying
astonishing
forward
story of Western
imperfectly and
civilization
stubbornly.
is
The
something like
things
this.
worth carrying.
Rome was a human
Rome is
attempt to
part of
hold
that
a
continuity.
large and complicated world
everything
together
Rome became.
under a shared set of
So are
laws
you,
and a
here,
shared language
in the quiet
and a
dark,
shared idea
at the
of
end
what
of a
living
2-hour
together in a
journey through
civilization could
15
mean.
centuries of
It
human
succeeded,
history.
imperfectly
You are
and
part of the
temporarily
same long
and magnificently, for
living
longer than
inside
almost
the
anything
inheritance,
else in human history.
breathing the Latin
And when
air
it could no
without
longer
knowing it,
hold its original
marked
shape,
by the Roman
it poured
clock,
itself into the
without
ground
feeling
of
the mark.
everything that followed. That is not falling.
why
That
did
is
Rome
becoming.
fall,
Is in the end a question about
Your
us.
breathing has
It is a
slowed.
question about what holds
You may not
large
even
human
be following
projects
the
together
words
and what
anymore.
pulls them apart.
And that is
about what
exactly
survives
right.
transformation
The
and what does
words
not.
are just a current
about how much
now,
of what we build
a
is
gentle
permanent
flow of
and how
sound,
much is contingent,
carrying you
dependent
in a
on
direction
conditions we
you
did
were
not
already
create
going.
and cannot entirely
The
control.
body knows how to
about
do
whether
this.
the things we
It has
value
been almost
doing it
law,
every night
language,
of your life.
shared belief,
The mind
possibility of
loosens its
peace
grip.
across large and
The
diverse
thoughts that were
populations
specific
are
and
durable
sequential
enough
a
to
few hours
outlast the
ago
political
have
structures
become
that first
something
gave them
more
form.
like weather,
Rome's
present,
answer,
but
worked
not
out across
requiring a
15
response.
centuries and still being
You
worked
are
out
in
today,
the place where
is
Rome
carefully,
is,
cautiously,
where all the history
incompletely,
is.
Yes,
where the long
the things
story
worth
of
keeping
everything
tend to
that has
survive
ever
the things
happened
that kept them.
settles
Not
into
always,
the wordless
not everywhere,
dark,
not
and
without
simply
loss,
rests.
but with a frequency and a persistence
Somewhere
that,
tonight,
in the long
the forum
view,
is still
genuinely
standing
remarkable.
in the dark. The stones are cool.
Let the
The cats
question
that live
rest
among the
now.
ruins are
It
quiet.
has earned its rest.
The Tiber moves below the hills the way it
Why
has been
did
moving
Rome
for
fall?
3,000 years, indifferent
You
to
have carried it
empires and
through
republics
empires
and crises
plagues
and transformations.
climate shifts,
Just moving,
and border crossings,
just carrying the water
and
of the
theological
Apennines to the sea,
controversies,
the way water
and
has
legal
always done and will
codifications,
always do.
and the long, patient
The Hagia
work of
Sophia's
monks in
dome
cold
is dark
rooms,
above Istanbul,
copying the words
its windows
of people
holding the
dead
city's light
1,000
for a
years.
few more hours until morning.
You have carried
Hadrian's
it all
Wall
the way
crosses
here,
its moors in
to
the
the
northern
edge of
dark,
sleep,
the wind
where
off the North
questions
Sea
loosen
moving
their
through
grip,
the grass between the
and
stones.
the answers stop needing
The
to be
roads are
precise,
still there, under the
and
asphalt,
the whole enormous
under the
story
centuries of mud
becomes
and use
something
and repair.
softer,
Still straight,
a texture,
still following the geometry of
feeling,
Roman surveyors who have been
the
dead
particular
for 1,500
quality of
years.
understanding that
All of
arrives
it is
not
still
as a
there.
conclusion,
All of it
but
is
as a
still in
settling.
its way, Rome. And you
Rome
are part
is
of it,
all around
simply
you
by
tonight,
being here, in a
in
world
the
it
language
made,
of these
in a night
sentences,
it named.
and the
Breathing
structure
in a
of the
rhythm
laws
it has
that
no
govern
claim
the
to,
world you
and yet
awake
somehow,
into,
in the deep
and
grammar
the
of the
faith that
civilization
shaped
that
the
shaped
civilization
you, still
that built
keeps.
the room you are lying in.
Sleep now.
It did
The
not
question
fall away
is
from the
answered.
world.
The story
It
is
became
told.
the world,
The roads lead
and the
everywhere
world,
they have always
still
led.
carrying it,
Through the
still
dark,
speaking its words,
through the centuries,
still
through
walking
the
its
soft
roads,
geography of
is
a resting
falling
mind,
gently now
toward
into the
morning,
same darkness that Rome
toward
fell
whatever
into,
ordinary,
not
magnificent
an ending,
human day
but a turning,
is waiting for you on the
the
other
long,
side of this
slow
night,
revolution of everything,
in the world that
toward
Rome
morning.
fell into and never
One more
entirely
chapter,
left.
then
Quiesce.
silence,
Quiet. Rest.
then sleep.
You have traveled a long way tonight. You have stood on the 7 hills and walked the forum in its noise and heat, and followed the legions to the edges of the known world, and sat with the philosophers in their late and melancholy evenings, and watched the borders dissolve, and the languages change, and the faith transform, and the stones outlast everything that quarried and cut and placed them. You have carried the question all the way here, to this last quiet place, where questions become unnecessary, and the breath slows to the pace of something very old and very patient. Rome is still falling. Rome is still standing. The night is still and deep, and full of everything that has ever been. And you are already almost gone, drifting down through the dark the way all things drift, the way empires drift, the way languages drift, gently and without resistance, toward the quiet place at the bottom of sleep, where nothing needs a name and nothing needs an answer, and the long story of everything rests, at last, in peace. Good night.